Attend, O reader, our tale of wonder. Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everybody. We are starting a new book this week. Uh, mm, 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 hot tea hot. Um, we're starting a new book this week. By Lewis Carroll. Uh, it is Beyond the Looking Glass. Did you know that? Did you know that Alice in Wonderland had a sequel? Most people don't. Most people will recognize some of the touchstones from this book, kind of having leached into a few adaptations on Alice in Wonderland. But most people do not know this is a book. Most people I've asked anyway. I've read this a few times, several times as a kid, and then just kind of coming back to it occasionally, being like, "Huh, that sure is math." Because this one's very much more blatantly mathy than the first book. Because, shocker, Lewis Carroll was actually a pretty popular mathematician in his day. So, yeah, most people I've talked to, usually if they know about this book, they only know the bare minimum about like the Red Queen and like the fact that it goes through a mirror like the title says. So anyway, let's let's dive right in with chapter 1, Looking Glass House. One thing was certain, that the white kitten had nothing to do with it. It was the black kitten's fault entirely. For the white kitten had been having its face washed by the old cat for the last quarter of an hour, and bearing it pretty well, all things considered. So you see that it couldn't have had any hand in the mischief. The way Dinah washed her children's faces was this. First she held the poor thing down by its ear with one paw, then with the other paw she rubbed its face all over, the wrong way, beginning at the nose. And just now, as I said, she was hard at work on the white kitten, which was lying quite still, and trying to purr, no doubt feeling that it was all meant for good. But the black kitten had been finished earlier in the afternoon, and so, while Alice was sitting curled up in the corner of the great armchair, half talking to herself and half asleep, the kitten had been having a grand game of romps with the ball of worsted that Alice had been trying to wind up, and had been rolling it up and down till it had all come undone again. And there it was, spread over the hearthrug, all knots and tangles. Excuse me. One of my cats is getting into mischief while the other one is cleaning himself. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to cease and desist. Whatever problem you are entertaining yourself with, please. Hi. Yes, you can look at me. Come on. Come sit with Dad. He's reading. Come on. Come here. Come on up here. Thank you, sir. Where was I? Worsted yarn. Up and down until it'd all come undone again, and there it was, spread over the hearthrug, all knots and tangles, with the kitten running after its own tail in the middle. "Oh, you wicked little thing!" cried Alice, catching up the kitten and giving it a little kiss to make it understand that it was in disgrace. "Really, Dinah ought to have taught you better manners. You ought, Dinah, you know you ought," she added, looking reproachfully at the old cat, and speaking in as cross a voice as she could manage. Then she scrambled back into the armchair, taking the kitten and the worsted with her, and began winding up the ball again. But she didn't get on very fast, as she was talking all the time, sometimes to the kitten, sometimes to herself. Kitty sat very demurely on her knee, pretending to watch the progress of the winding, and now and then putting out one paw and gently touching the ball, as if it would be glad to help, if it might. "Do you know what tomorrow is, Kitty?" Alice began. "You'd have guessed if you'd been up in the window with me, only Dinah was making you tidy, so you couldn't. I was watching the boys getting sticks for a bonfire, and it wants plenty of sticks, Kitty, only it got so cold, and it snowed so they had to leave off. Never mind, Kitty, we'll go and see the bonfire tomorrow." Here Alice wound up 2 or 3 turns of the worsted round the kitten's neck, just to see how it would look. This led to a scramble in which the ball rolled down upon the floor, and yards and yards of it got unwound again. "Do you know, I was so angry, Kitty," Alice went on, as soon as they were comfortably settled again. "When I saw all the mischief you'd been doing, I was very nearly opening the window and putting you out in the snow. You'd have deserved it, you mischievous little darling. What have you got to say for yourself? Now don't interrupt me," she went on, holding up one finger. "I'm going to tell you all your faults. Number 1, you squeaked twice while Dinah was washing your face this morning. Now you can't deny it, Kitty. I heard you. What's that you say?" And she pretended that the kitten was speaking. "Her paw went into your eye? Well, that's your fault for keeping your eyes open. If you'd shut them tight up, it wouldn't have happened. Don't make any more excuses, but listen. Number 2, you pulled Snowdrop away by the tail just as I'd put the saucer of milk before her. What, you were thirsty, were you? How do you know she wasn't thirsty too? For number 3, you unwound every bit of the worsted while I wasn't looking. That's 3 faults, Kitty, and you've not been punished for any of them yet. You know I'm saving up all your punishments for Wednesday week. Oh, suppose they had saved up all my punishments," she went on, talking more to herself than the kitten. "What would they do at the end of the year? I should be sent to prison, I suppose, when the day came, or, let me see, suppose each punishment was to be going without dinner. Well, then when the miserable day came, I should have to go without 50 dinners at once. I shouldn't mind that much. I'd far rather go without them than eat them. Do you hear the snow against the window panes, Kitty? How nice and soft it sounds, just as if someone was kissing the window all over outside. I wonder if the snow loves the trees and fields since it's kissing them so gently. Then it covers them up snug, you know, with a white quilt, and perhaps it says, 'Oh, go to sleep, darlings, till the summer comes again.' And when they wake up in the summer, Kitty, they dress themselves all in green and dance about wherever the wind blows. Oh, that's very pretty," cried Alice, dropping the ball of worsted to clap her hands. "I do so wish it was true. I'm sure the woods look sleepy in the autumn when the leaves are getting brown." I forgot how much dialogue Alice has. Also, you can very visibly tell that Alice has been blatantly affected by her time in Wonderland at this point. She's kind of like, she has that sort of wandering, meandering thought pattern already. "Thank you for the purse, library. Now you're being a model citizen, aren't you? Not like the little black kitty here, huh?" Magnus just turned and looked at me like I wasn't doing anything. "Yeah, you're not. The one in the book is." "No, Kitty, can you play chess? Now don't smile, my dear. I'm asking it seriously. Because when we were just playing now, you watched just as if you understood it, and when I said check, you purred. Well, it was a nice check, Kitty. Really, I might have won if it hadn't been for that nasty knight that came wiggling down among my pieces, Kitty. Oh dear, let's pretend. And here I wish I could tell you half the things Alice used to say, beginning with her favorite phrase, 'Let's pretend.' She had had quite a long argument with her sister only the day before, all because Alice had begun with 'Let's pretend we're kings and queens,' and her sister, who liked being very exact, argued that they couldn't because there were only 2 of them, and Alice had been reduced at last to say, 'Well, you can be one of them then, and I'll be all the rest.' And once she had really frightened her old nurse by shouting suddenly in her ear, 'Nurse, do let's pretend I'm a hungry hyena and you're a bone.' But this is taking us away from Alice's speech to the kitten. 'Let's pretend you're the Red Queen, Kitty. Do you know, I think if you sat up and folded your arms, you'd look exactly like her. Now do try, there's a dear.' And Alice got the Red Queen off the table and set it up before the kitten as a model for it to imitate. However, the thing didn't succeed, principally, Alice said, because the kitten wouldn't fold its arms properly. So, to punish it, she held it up to the looking-glass that it might see how skulky it was. 'And if you're not good directly, I'll put you through the looking-glass house. How'd you like that?' Now, if you only attend, Kitty, and not talk so much, I'll tell you all my ideas about the looking-glass house. First, there's the room you can see through the glass. That's just the same as our drawing room, only things go the other way. I can see all of it when I get up on a chair, all but the bit beyond the fireplace. Oh, I do wish I could see that bit. I want so much to know whether they fire in the winter. You never can tell, unless our fire smokes. Then smoke comes up in that room, too, but that may only be pretense, just to make it look as if they had a fire. Well, then the books are something like our books, only the words go the wrong way. I know that because I've held up one of our books to the glass, and then they hold up one in the other room. How would you like to live in the looking-glass house, Kitty? I wonder if they'd give you milk in there. Perhaps looking-glass milk isn't good to drink, but... Oh, Kitty, now we come to the passage. You can just see a little peep of the passage look in the looking-glass house if you leave the door of our drawing-room wide open. And it's very like our passage as far as you can see, only, it may be quite different on beyond. Oh, Kitty, how nice it would be if we could only get through into the looking-glass house. I'm sure it's got, such beautiful things in it. Let's pretend there's a way of getting through into it somehow, Kitty. Let's pretend the glass has gone all soft like gauze so we can get through. Why, it's turning into a sort of mist now, I declare. It'll be easy enough to get through. She was up on the chimney-piece while she said this, though she hardly knew how she'd got there. And certainly the glass was beginning to melt away, just like a bright silvery mist. I want to have something open over here just in case. Oh, yeah, library. Is it get off your phone? You're streaming. Yes, I know. In another moment, Alice was through the glass and had jumped lightly down into the looking-glass room. The very first thing she did was to look whether there was a fire in the fireplace, and she was quite pleased to find that there was a real one, blazing away as brightly as the one she had left behind. So I shall be as warm here as I was in the old room, thought Alice. Warmer, in fact, as there will be no one here to scold me away from the fire. Oh, what fun it'll be when they can see me through the glass in here and can't get at me. Then she began looking about, and noticed that what could be seen from the old room was quite common and uninteresting, but that all the rest was as different as possible. For instance, the pictures on the wall next to the fire seemed to be all alive, and the very clock on the chimney-piece, you can only see the back of it in the looking-glass, had got the face of a little old man, and it grinned at her. Well, they don't keep this room so tidy as the other, Alice thought to herself, as she noticed several of the chessmen down in the hearth among the cinders. But in another moment, with a little of surprise, she was down on her hands and knees watching them. The chessmen were walking about, 2 by 2. Here are the Red King and the Red Queen, Alice said in a whisper for fear of frightening them. And here are the White King and the White Queen, sitting on the edge of the shovel. Here are 2 castles walking arm in arm. I don't think they can hear me, she went on as she put her head closer down. I'm nearly sure they can't see me. I feel somehow as if I were invisible. Here something began squeaking on the table behind Alice, and made her turn her head just in time to see one of the white pawns roll over and begin kicking. She watched it with a great curiosity to see what would happen next. Oh, it's the voice of my child, the White Queen cried out as she rushed past the king, so violently that she knocked him over among the cinders. My precious Lily, my imperial kitten! And she began scrambling wildly up the side of the fender. Imperial fiddlestick, said the king, rubbing his nose, which had been hurt by the fall. He had a right to be a little annoyed with the queen, for he was covered with ashes from head to foot. Alice was very anxious to be of use, and as the poor little Lily was nearly screaming herself into a fit, she hastily picked up the queen and set her on the table by the side of her noisy little daughter. The queen gasped and sat down. The rapid journey through the air had quite taken away her breath, and for a minute or two she could do nothing but hug the little Lily in silence. As soon as she'd recovered her breath a little, she called out to the White King, who was sitting sulkily among the ashes. Mind the volcano. Oh, what volcano? Said the king, looking up anxiously into the fire, as if he thought that was the most likely place to find one. Blew me up, panted the queen, who was still a little out of breath. Mind you, come up the regular way. Don't get blown up. Alice watched the White King as he slowly struggled from bar to bar, till at last she said, "Why, you'll be hours and hours getting to the table at that rate. I'd far better help you, hadn't I?" But the king took no notice of the question. It was quite clear that he could neither hear nor see her. And so Alice picked him up very gently, and lifted him across more slowly than she'd lifted the queen, that she mightn't take his breath away. But before she put him on the table, she thought she might as well dust him off a little, since he was so covered in ashes. She said afterwards that she had never seen in all her life such a face as the king had made when he found himself held in the air by an invisible hand and was being dusted. He was far too astonished to cry out, but his eyes and mouth went on getting larger and larger, rounder and rounder, till her hand shook so much with laughing that she nearly let him drop upon the floor. "Oh, please don't make such faces, my dear," she cried out, quite forgetting the king couldn't hear her. "You make me laugh so I can hardly hold you. Don't keep your mouth so wide open, all the ashes will get into it. There, I think you're tidy enough now," she added, as she smoothed his hair and set him upon the table near the queen. The king immediately fell flat upon his back and lay perfectly still, and Alice was a little alarmed at what she had done, and went round the room to see if she could find any water to throw over him. However, she could find nothing but a bottle of ink, and when she got back with it, she found that he had recovered, and he and the queen were talking together in a frightened whisper, so low that Alice could hardly hear what they said. The king was saying, "I assure you, my dear, I turned cold to the very end of my whiskers." To which the queen replied, "Well, you haven't got any whiskers." "The horror of that moment I shall never, never forget." "Oh, you will know, if you don't make a memorandum of it." Alice looked on with great interest as the king took an enormous memorandum book out of his pocket and began writing. A sudden thought struck her, and she took hold of the end of the pencil, which came some way over his shoulder, and began writing for him. The poor king looked puzzled and unhappy, and struggled with the pencil for some time without saying anything, but Alice was too strong for him, and at last he panted out, "My dear, I must get a thinner pencil. If I can't manage this one a bit, it writes all manner of things I don't intend." "What manner of things?" said the queen, looking over the book, in which Alice had put the White King is sliding down the poker. "He balances very badly." "That's not a memorandum of your feelings." There was a book lying near Alice on the table, and while she sat watching the White King, for she was still a little anxious about him, and had the ink all ready to throw over him in case he fainted again, she turned over the leaves to find some part that she could read, for it's all in some language I don't know. It was like this. Oh, it's backwards. Jabberwocky. Oh, this is the Jabberwocky poem. I won't try and read it backwards. She puzzled over this for some time, but at last a bright thought struck her. "Why, it's a looking-glass book, of course. If I hold it up to the glass, the words will all go the right way again." And this was the poem that Alice read. Jabberwocky. 'Twas Breelig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the Jub bird, and shun the frumious bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the manxome foe he sought. So rested he by the tum-tum tree, and stood awhile in thought. And as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood, and burbled as it came. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker-snack, snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. "And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy, O frabjous day, callooh, callay," he chortled in his joy. 'Twas Breelig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe. I can't believe the cult following just for Jabberwocky. I can't believe it either. The Jabberwocky is one of the few elements that very consistently makes it out of this book into Alice adaptations. Also, that poem has been set to an uncountable number of tunes. I did a really, really fun setting of it. Um, oh man, it was for, oh, what was it for? Yeah, I think it was for high school choir, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. And I really wish I could remember the composer's name because it was a really fun setting. Like it plays with a lot of how it plays with a lot of how the rhythm of these nonsense words uh bounce off of each other and kind of like it snicker snack and kaloo kalay, they're so very bouncy and jumpy. It led to a lot of like the ancillary parts, so to speak, the altos bouncing around on that and like the basses bouncing around on that. It was very, very fun. um oh man, and I really wish I remembered the composer who had set that because it's really fun. And like I don't know if you could hear in the way I was saying that. Oh man, I'm trying to remember the note it's on. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock, the Jabberwock, my son? I think the dynamics are all wrong there. There's like a whole like it's really, really, it plays with like the first one is like really, really loud, big forte, and then you immediately pull all the way back down into this very, very small pianissimo, and then like you kind of bump back up to a mezzo forte for the my son, and like that's obviously not the main melody line because I'm a bass, and that's not what I get in life. But if any of you with a musical ear can somehow pick that specific line I just did and be like, "Oh yeah, that's this person's run on the music," please tell me. I've been looking for the sheet music for it forever because it's just so fun. And like, yeah, I could probably dig around for like some programs I saved from high school choir to try and find it. But I can't remember if it was like actually from high school choir or like it was from one of the 5 billion events I did. But it was a really, really fun take on it. And yeah, it's far from the only one, as I have become very aware of looking for, oh yeah, is it set to this? Is it set to that? And it's like, it's clearly one of those pieces that was like written once and then transposed into a, oh, excuse me, transposed in a wide variety of settings, so it's not just soprano, alto, tenor, bass. But it was really fun. And like, there's this whole thing about this book in general kind of has a lot of those nonsensical words that were nonsensical at the time, but kind of now in modernity have gotten uh, you know back defined into an actual word. It was a whole there was a whole culture of like building fake words out of various word roots as a fun little party game for a while at the time that this was written. And like Carol also just really loved to like throw just syllables together, just kind of glue syllables together to make a word sound like what it is, to give a specific feeling or intent, almost kind of like constructing a language but without meaning. It's very, very interesting, and I really, really I like it. It makes this book in particular. This book leans on it much, much harder than Alice in Wonderland, as I recall. It comes out the gate with this Jabberwock poem, and it just really says, "I'm gonna be weird. You thought Wonderland was weird? I'm gonna get real weird." Like Wonderland kind of like plays off of like taking phrases literally and like taking turns of phrase that are very much not literal literally, like beat time, for example. That might actually be in this book. I can't remember, but there's specifically, I remember a passage about, no, that's at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. Uh, this is the version Arnell would like. There's a link. I'm gonna click that for later. Ooh, okay. I'm gonna watch that later. That looks fun. But yeah, no, it was at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. There's this whole passage about Alice learning to play music, and that's why Father Time doesn't like her because she's beating time in the sense of like 1, 2, 3, 4 beating time, and it's a very fun like wordplay thing, and that's kind of what the first book focuses on. But this one kind of leans into that more, uh, building nonsense words to have a specific, uh, building nonsense words to have a specific feeling for like the average reader. Um, Your version is probably this Goriki wizard. Hmm. What's the vibe on this? I'm excited that you're reading the sequel. Thank you, RNL. Uh I have been sitting on this one for a while, and I'm like, you know what? I have been sitting on this for way too long. That would be ooh, sneaky RNL Quendy is here, hooray. Very funny. Yeah, not a lot of people know it, and it's really good. I'm not gonna lie to you. I knew I was gonna get distracted the second the Jabberwocky poem came up. And I was like, oh no, that's later in the book. That's later after she does this, this, and this. I'll be fine. I can get a good ways into the book. Nope. Uh, it's real early. But like there's a bunch of elements from this book that like I will point them out as we go. Anyway, Jabberwocky is like probably the iconic thing. And like Vorpal's sword has completely transcended this book. It's like a whole thing. I think partially that's the fault of D&D, that Vorpal was an adjective you could apply to a sword in Dungeons and Dragons, and like it had a boosted decapitation chance on crits and stuff. So like, the concept of a Vorpal sword being a very, very powerful blade that is likely to decapitate someone has seeped into the pop culture at large. And I love that. Because it's like you read this and you're like, is that where that's from? What? You know? There's gonna be a lot of, is that where that's from? What? If you're following along and you've never read this before. Anyway, I've wandered 1,000 different directions. Let's actually continue reading the book, shall we? It seems very pretty, she said when she'd finished it, but it's rather hard to understand. You see, she didn't like to confess, even to herself, that she couldn't make it out at all. Somehow it seems to fill my head with ideas, only I don't exactly know what they are. However, somebody killed something? That's clear at any rate. But, oh, thought Alice, suddenly jumping up. If I don't make haste, I'll have to go back through the looking-glass, for I've seen the rest of the house is like. Well, let's have a look at the garden first. Oh, the garden. She was out of the room in a moment, and ran downstairs, or at least it wasn't exactly running, but a new invention of hers for getting downstairs quickly and easily, as Alice said to herself. She just kept the tips of her fingers on the handrail and floated gently down without even touching the stairs with her feet. Then she floated on through the hall, and would have gone straight out the door in the same way if she hadn't caught hold of the doorpost. She was getting a little giddy with so much floating in the air, and was rather glad to find herself walking again in a natural way. The intersection of well-read nerd and gaming nerd is a great place to be. I am so happy to find myself at that intersection every now and again. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I've seen that here, 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 and here. Is this where it's from? I don't know. Is Vorpal still an adjective for a sword in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons? That's a question I need to Google right now. Vorpal sword 5e, because that seems like the type of thing, like, if it's not in 5th edition D&D, it would not have gotten out of 3.5. Oh no, it is! It's on D&D Beyond. You gain a +3. Nah, I probably shouldn't read that on stream, but it's a +3 sword. And if you roll a 20, you cut off one of the creature's heads. Vorpal is still a thing. Yes. It's immune to the effect if it can't take slashing damage, or it has legendary actions, or it's too big for its head to be cut off, or it doesn't need its head. Cool. At least it gives you something for like, oh yeah, if it doesn't have a head to get cut off, you still get this. Keen became a thing with 3rd edition. That's a good adjective. I love like I especially love how Monster of the Week does like weapon adjectives. Like literally the stats of a weapon are just adjectives in Monster of the Week. But I love how like adjectives on a weapon just kind of become like a specific effect. You know, like Vorpal, you can say, oh yeah, this is a Vorpal sword, this is a Vorpal longsword, this is a Vorpal spear. You know, any sort of blade can become Vorpal, or keen, or flame bitten, or dancing, you know? And it's just like a big class of effects that you can apply to a weapon. We weaponize words, yes. Sometimes literally. I was reading Wordenize Weapons. Yes, very in the spirit of this book, Gree. Wordenize Weapons. Oh, what was I gonna say? I was reading Dot Dungeon, which is another RPG system that kind of like plays with the intersection of you as a person and then the character you're playing in game, and how that, you know, meshes into each other. Like, and like the way it kind of like it lets you apply. There's literally a class called like the Scribe or something that like you bring like a set of like books that are your spell book, and you get to pick random adjectives out of the book that you can apply to things to create spells. Or like another really fun one that's not quite on topic is the Bard, where you create character playlists, or you create a master playlist that each has on the playlist has a song for each character in the party and each person playing the character in the party, and as long as that song goes, they get a buff in game. You know, it it reaches through the fourth wall to make mechanical effects happen, and I'm so here for it. I want to play it so bad. And the best thing about it is like it's designed to be like, yeah, steal an existing MMO's world to have people create characters in, so it's very easy to run. Have I mentioned I would really love to play a tabletop game with the Codex gang? I think I ran that past when we were thinking about projects other than book club each month. I was like, oh, what if we do someone suggested a writing challenge, and I was like, how about we do these kind of active prompts solo tabletop RPGs, which I need to run that past y'all again. My first real D&D group had a bard whose player was learning the guitar. He wanted to cast spells with riffs he was learning. That's fun. That's a really fun, like, oh yeah, I learned this riff and I have applied it to this spell. That's fun. Anyway, oh, I mentioned Codex, so we should talk about that before I start the next chapter. Codex, which has a chat command that I can't type because I have a cat on my lap. If someone could type !Codex in the chat, if you would be so kind. So Codex is a group of reading streamers, a little bit like me. We all kind of have one night a week or 2 nights a week or however much time we stream where we throw a book up on screen. Some of us don't have the book on screen, but it's fine. Usually we throw a book on screen and we read aloud, just like I'm doing. There's also a monthly book club that I don't think I can make this month, just out of the sheer factor of I did not grab the book fast enough. They're doing one of the Ender's Game sequels, which I'm gonna turn up to somebody's chat for that, because I want to know what people's. That's really soon, actually. I think it's later next week, the 28th, maybe. Yeah, I will absolutely host someone who is streaming the book club, and I'm gonna turn up to that. I just didn't get a hold of the Ender's Game sequel they were reading fast enough, and despite the fact that I've read the first Ender's Game and it's a great book, and I wanted to join in this time, just too many things were on fire this month. Next weekend? Question mark. Yeah, it's sometime very soon. I'll yell about it on Twitter probably. But I will definitely be hosting someone who's streaming book club whenever it happens, because it's kind of like an academic discussion. I'll be attending, but in chat. I haven't read it, and I only know the movie. Fair. Honestly, I read the first Ender's Game and went, that's a really long series that I don't have time for, and I didn't read the rest of them. Because I have so many books piled up in my shelf that I wish I could read on stream, but I can't. But yeah, it's kind of like an academic back and forth, quite literally a book club, where we kind of pick apart, like, oh man, this scene was really effective. Why is it that way? The only one I've managed to find time to show up this weekend, says Arnell. Yeah, I don't know. One of those. This weekend feels early. 24 feels early. I don't know. But anyway, the one I attended was Flowers for Algernon, which was fantastic because Flowers for Algernon has been adapted enough times that some people watched the movie to go with the whole book. Some people read just the short story. Me, I'm some people. And some people read both the short story and the book. Oh, book club that I've been rattling about is tomorrow at 6 p.m. I guess I'm having that on while I play Splatoon. Oh, heck. I agree, oh, heck. 6 p.m. CST. Ooh. Thank you for giving that in Central Time. That's where I am right now. Anyway. Yeah, Codex exists. It's great. Wait, in how many hours? That's less than 12 hours. It's 9 CST right now. Calculating. Ruminating. Hang on. My brain is smooth. That's in 9 hours? Wait, no. Wrong. 24 minus 3 is 21 hours. Brain smooth. Anyway, yeah, Codex is real great. Gariki and RNL are fellow Codex streamers. And we kind of broadly focus on different books. Speaker for the Dead is the title. Thank you. I couldn't remember it. I knew it was in the Ender's Game series, and I couldn't remember which one. We kind of broadly focus on different genres. Gariki's been doing a lot of Japanese folklore and fairy tales, which has been fascinating when I can manage to catch it. Wait, 9 p.m. Friday? Next Friday or this Friday? Oh no, it's right now 9 p.m. Friday. My brain's large. Anyway, yeah. Gariki has been doing what I said, kind of those folk tales and fairy tales, which have been very interesting when I can catch the VODs for it, because he streams at a very different time than me. Arnell has been doing a lot of, you've been picking up a lot of manga lately, haven't you? Like kind of a light novel-y thing? It's been very interesting, when I can catch it. Who else can I think of? Atkinson's been doing something that is entirely unclear from his stream titles. He has been streaming, like, while I have been big busy too. But anyway, I digress a great deal. Oh, I have an ellipse in the chat. Question of the day. Yes, I'm a box of chocolate. I'll be busy modding all day tomorrow, then start with book club, and then a long Empyrean stream. My voice is trash right now, or I'd be reading. Hide and Seek. Oh, Hide and Seek is a book. I thought that was just kind of like a clever title for a different thing he was doing. I didn't know that. But as you can see, I'm very perceptive and observant. But yeah, long story short, Codex is great. there's a Discord server that's a little ways up in the chat now. Um, he reads a lot of modern authors and gets permission. Oh, I'm jealous. I haven't gotten any emails back from people that I've been asking permission from. Jubilee OB is the same way. She does a lot of the modern authors with permission. She was doing Diablo last time I saw. It's been a while. She's been busy. She's got a lot of lives to juggle. But I digress. There's a lot of reading streamers out in the world, and we've all kind of gravitated into the Codex Discord, and occasionally more and more people kind of filter in there as we're like, hey, this person reads. Do they want to come join the group? I think it's actually a Twitch team now. Somebody managed that. I don't remember who. I just know that Atkinson and Gariki and his name starts with a J. My brain's smooth. What's his name? Can't remember his name. My brain's smooth. Promise this is not a snub. Just my brain is full of Swiss cheese holes. It happened. It's a Twitch team. It should be linked next to my category, and that should be a list of everyone. Anyway, we've wandered far from the book this evening. Jeffrey, thank you. I knew it started with a J. Thank you so much, Gariki. My apologies. Oh, yeah. Gentle Fox does kind of an ASMR thing, is another Codex streamer. He made partner. I completely spaced that he made partner. Points, man. Anyway, we have wandered off into the weeds quite aggressively. Let's dive into Chapter 2, shall we? Chapter 2, The Garden of Live Flowers. I should see the garden far better, said Alice to herself, if I could get to the top of the hill, and here is a path that leads straight to it. At least, no, it doesn't do that, after going a few yards along the path and turning several sharp corners. But I suppose it will at last. But how curiously it twists. It's more like a corkscrew than a path. Well, this turn goes to the hill, I suppose. No, it doesn't. This goes straight back to the house. Well, I'll try it the other way. And so she did, wandering up and down and trying turn after turn, but always coming back to the house to do what she would. Indeed, once when she turned a corner rather more quickly than usual, she ran against it before she could stop herself. It's no use talking about it, Alice said, looking up at the house and pretending it was arguing with her. I'm not going in again yet. I know I should have to get through the looking-glass again, back into my old room. There'd be an end to all of my adventures. So, resolutely turning her back upon the house, she set out once more down the path, determined to keep straight on till she got to the hill. For a few minutes all went on well, and she was just saying, I really shall do it this time, when the path gave a sudden twist and shook itself, as she described it afterwards, and the next moment she found herself actually walking into the door. Oh, that's too bad. I never saw such a house for getting in the way. Never. However, there was the hill full in sight, so there was nothing to be done but start again. This time she came upon a large flower bed with a border of daisies and a willow tree growing in the middle. Don't mind me. Just seeing if my lurk command works. It does. Let's go. I forgot it worked that way. Anyway, willow tree growing in the middle is where we left off. Oh, Tiger Lily, said Alice, addressing to herself to one that was waving gracefully about in the wind. I wish you could talk. We can't talk. Well, there's anybody worth talking to, said the Tiger Lily. Alice was so astonished she could not speak for a minute. It quite seemed to take her breath away. At length, as the Tiger Lily only went on waving about, she spoke again in a timid voice, almost in a whisper. Can all the flowers talk? As well as you can. A great deal louder, said the Tiger Lily. It isn't manners for us to begin, you know, said the Rose. I really was wondering when you'd speak, said I to myself. Her face has got some sense in it, though it's not a clever one. Still, you're the right colour. That goes a long way. I don't care about the colour, the Tiger Lily remarked.
If only your petals curl up a little more, she'd be all right.
Alice didn't like being criticized, so she began asking questions. Aren't you sometimes frightened about being planted out here with nobody to take care of you? Well, there's the tree in the middle. What else is it good for? Come here, kitty. Come lie down. But what could you do if any danger came? It says bow wow, cried a daisy. That's why its branches are called bows. Did you know that? Cried another daisy, and here they all began shouting together till the air seemed quite full of little shrill voices.
Silence, every one of you,
cried the tiger lily, waving itself passionately from side to side and trembling with excitement.
They know I can't get at them,
it panted, bending its quivering head toward Alice, or they wouldn't dare do it. Never mind, Alice said in a soothing tone, and stooping down to the daisies, who were just beginning again, she whispered, If you don't hold your tongues, I'll pick you. There was silence in a moment, and several of the pink daisies turned white.
That's right,
said the tiger lily.
The daisies are worst of all. When one speaks, they all begin together, and it's enough to make one wither the way they hear to go on.
How's it you all can talk so nicely? Alice said, hoping to get it into a better temper by a compliment. I've been in many gardens before, but none of the flowers can talk.
Put your hand down, feel the ground, then you'll know why.
Alice did so. It's very hard, but I don't see what that has to do with it.
In most gardens, they make the beds too soft. So soft the flowers are always asleep.
This seemed a very good reason, and Alice was quite pleased to know it. Well, I never thought of that before.
It's my opinion you never think at all.
Wait, no, that's the rose. It's my opinion you never think at all. I never saw anybody that looked stupider, Violet said, so suddenly that Alice quite jumped. It hadn't spoken before.
Hold your tongue. If you ever saw anybody, you keep your head under the leaves, snoring away there, till you know no more what's going on in the world than if you were in bed.
Are there any more people in the garden beside me? Choosing not to notice the rose's last remark. There's one other flower in the garden. There's one other flower in the garden that can move about like you. I wonder how you do it.
You're always wondering.
Oh, but she's more bushy than you are. She like me? Alice asked eagerly, for the thought had crossed her mind. There's another little girl in the garden somewhere. Well, she has the same awkward shape as you, but she's redder, and her petals are shorter, I think.
Her petals are always just out up close, like a dahlia, and tumbled about like yours, anyhow.
Oh, but that's not your fault. You're beginning to fade, you know, and then one can't help one's petals getting a little untidy. Alice didn't like this idea at all, so to change the subject, she asked, Does she ever come out here? I dare say you'll see her soon. She's one of the thorny kind. Where does she wear the thorns? Alice asked with some curiosity. Why, all around her head, of course. I was wondering you hadn't got some, too. I thought it was the regular rule. She's coming, cried the larkspur. I hear her footsteps thump, thump, thump along the gravel walk. Alice looked round eagerly and found that it was the Red Queen. Well, she's grown a good deal, was her first remark. She had indeed. When Alice first found her in the ashes, she'd only been 3 inches high, and here she was, half a head taller than Alice herself. It's the fresh air that does it. Wonderfully fine air out here. It is. I think I'll go and meet her, Alice said, for though the flowers were interesting enough, she felt that it would be far grander to have a talk with a real queen. You can't possibly do that. I should advise you to walk the other way. This sounded nonsensical to Alice, so she said nothing, but set off at once toward the Red Queen. To her surprise, she lost sight of her in a moment, and found herself walking back in at the front door again. A little provoked, she drew back, and after looking everywhere for the Queen, whom she spied out at last, a long way off, she thought she would try the plan, this time, of walking in the opposite direction. So, little aside here, the talking flowers, which most people attribute to the Disney adaptation of the first book come from here. They're not quite so they're not quite so personality driven in the film. They're all just kind of very rude. But no, each of these different types of flowers has kind of a distinct personality that I was trying to get across there. The Red Queen also comes up in the Disney movie very blatantly, and she's from here. In the sense of, this confused me when I was very young reading this initially. And for those of you who don't know, the black side of a chessboard at some point in antiquity was much more commonly red. And that confused me because I grew up playing chess sets and it's like, whoa, it's white and black, white and black, white and black. And I had not seen a white and red chess set. I was like, huh, well, they must be talking about chess because of, the earlier descriptions, but why red? It's just that's kind of a regionalism. I think it's more suited to Britain in general. But yeah, these are a majority, more of these elements that come up in the Disney movie and do come up in the second. What's the director's name? The live action Alice in Wonderland films. The Vorpal sword. Alice kind of gets the Vorpal sword and goes to hassle the Red Queen good and proper. Oh, who did the live action films? Was it Tim Burton? Tim Burton sounds correct, but I'm not sure. All I know is Hot Topic loved them very much. Anyway, book. A little provoked, she drew back, and after looking everywhere for the Queen, whom she spied out at last, a long way off, she thought she would try the plan, this time of walking in the opposite direction. It succeeded beautifully. She had not been walking a minute before she found herself face to face with the Red Queen, and in full sight of the hill she had been so long aiming at. Terry Gilliam did the Hot Topic vibe Alice in Wonderlands. I think my brain immediately jumped to who it did because I was like, oh yeah, Hot Topic. Actually did a Jabberwocky. That's fascinating because I did not watch those movies. Tim Burton did do an Alice at some point. Okay, my brain's not too far off. That's interesting. That might make for a fun little Discord movie night. Who knows? Could be, could not be. We'll see. Where do you come from? Said the Red Queen. Where are you going? Look up, speak nicely, don't twiddle your fingers all the time. Alice attended to all these directions and explained, as well she could, that she'd lost her way. I don't know what you mean by your way, said the Queen. All the ways about here belong to me. But why did you come out here at all? Curtsy while you're thinking what to say. It saves time. Alice wondered a little at this, but she was too much in awe of the Queen to disbelieve it. I'll try it when I go home, she thought to herself. The next time I'm a little late for dinner. It's time for you to answer now, the Queen said, looking at her watch. Open your mouth a little wider when you speak, and always say, Your Majesty. I only wanted to see what the garden was like, Your Majesty. That's right, said the Queen, patting her on the head, which Alice didn't like at all. Though when you say garden, I've seen gardens compared with this, which would be wilderness. Alice didn't dare to argue the point, but went on. I thought I'd try and find my way to the top of that hill. When you say hill, I could show you hills, in a comparison with which you'd call that a valley. No, I shouldn't, Alice said, surprised into contradicting her at last. A hill can't be a valley, that would be nonsense. The Red Queen shook her head. You may call it nonsense if you like, but I've heard nonsense compared with that which would be as sensible as a dictionary. Alice curtsied again, as she was afraid from the Queen's tone, and she was a little offended, and they walked on in silence till they got up to the top of the little hill. For some minutes Alice stood, without speaking, looking out in all directions over the country, and a most curious country it was. There were a number of tiny little brooks running straight across it, from side to side, and the ground between which was divided up into squares by a number of little green hedges that reached from brook to brook. I declare it's marked out just like a large chessboard, Alice said at last. There ought to be some men moving about somewhere, and so there are. she added in a tone of delight, and her heart began to beat quick with excitement as she went on. "It's a great huge game of chess that's being played all over the world. If this is the world at all, you know. Oh, what fun it is! How I wish I was one of them! I wouldn't mind being a pawn, if only I might join, though of course I should like to be a queen best." She glanced rather shyly at the real queen as she said this, but her companion only smiled pleasantly and said, "Well, that's easily managed. You could be the white queen's pawn if you like, as Lily's too young to play, and you're in the second square to begin with. When you get to the 8th square, you'll be a queen." Just at this moment, somehow or other, they began to run. Alice never could quite make out, in thinking it over afterwards, how it was that they began. All she remembers is that they were running, hand in hand, and the queen went so fast it was all she could do to keep up with her. And still the queen kept crying, "Faster, faster!" But Alice felt she could not go faster, though she had not breath left to say so. The most curious part of the thing was that the trees and other things around them never changed their places at all. However fast they went, they never seemed to pass anything. "I wonder if all the things move along with us?" thought poor, puzzled Alice, and the queen seemed to guess her thoughts, for she cried, "Faster! Don't try to talk!" Not that Alice had any idea of doing that. She felt as if she'd never be able to talk again. She was getting so much out of breath, and still the queen cried, "Faster, faster!" and dragged her along. "Are we nearly there?" Alice managed to pant out at last. "Nearly there?" the queen repeated. "We passed it 10 minutes ago. Faster!" And they ran on for a time in silence, with the wind whistling in Alice's ears, and almost blowing her hair off her head, she fancied. "Now, now, faster, faster!" cried the queen, and they went so fast that at last they seemed to skim through the air, hardly touching the ground with their feet, till suddenly, just as Alice was getting quite exhausted, they stopped, and she found herself sitting on the ground, breathless and giddy. The queen propped her up against a tree and said kindly, "You may rest a little now." Alice looked round to great surprise. "Why, I do believe we've been under this tree the whole time. Everything's just as it was." "Oh, of course it is. Where else would you have it?" "Well, in our country," Alice said, still panting a little, "you'd generally get to somewhere else if you ran very fast for a long time, as we've been doing." "Well, what a slow sort of country," said the queen. "Now here, you see, takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that." "I'd rather not try, please," said Alice. "I'm quite content to stay here, only I am so hot and thirsty." "I know what you'd like," the queen said, good-naturedly, taking a little box out of her pocket. "Have a biscuit?" Alice thought it would not be civil to say no, though it wasn't at all what she wanted. So she took it, and ate it as well as she could. It was very dry, as though and she thought she had never been so nearly choked in all her life. "While you're refreshing yourself, I'll just take the measurements." And the queen took a ribbon out of her pocket, marked in inches, and began measuring the ground, sticking little pegs in here and there. "At the end of 2 yards," she said, putting in a peg to mark the distance, "I shall give you your directions. Have another biscuit?" "No, thank you. One's quite enough." "Thirst quenched, I hope," said the queen. Alice didn't know what to say to this, but luckily the queen did not wait for an answer, instead going on. "At the end of 3 yards I shall repeat them, for fear of forgetting them. At the end of 4 I shall say good-bye, and at the end of 5 I shall go." She had gotten all the pegs put in by this time, and Alice looked on with great interest as she returned to the tree and began slowly walking down the row. At the 2-yard peg she faced round and said, "A pawn goes 2 squares in its first move, you know, so you'll go very quickly through the 3rd square, by railway, I should think, and you'll find yourself in the 4th square in no time. Well, that square belongs to Tweedledum and Tweedledee. The 5th is mostly water, the 6th belongs to Humpty Dumpty, but you make no remark. I didn't know I had to make one just then. You should have said it's all extremely kind of you to tell me all this. However, we'll suppose it's said. The 7th square is all forest. One of the knights will show you the way. And in the 8th square we shall be queens together. It's all feasting and fun." Alice got up and curtsied and sat down again. At the next peg, the queen turned again, and this time she said, "Speak in French when you can't think of the English for a thing. Turn out your toes as you walk, and remember who you are." She did not wait for Alice to curtsy this time, but walked on quickly to the next peg, where she turned for a moment to say good-bye, then hurried on to the last. How it happened, Alice never knew, but exactly as she'd come to the last peg, she was gone. Whether she vanished into the air, or whether she ran very quickly into the wood, and she can run very fast, thought Alice. There was no way of guessing, but she was gone, and Alice began to remember that she was a pawn. Soon it would be time for her to move. I'm just immediately picturing just like a shriek, instant transmission noise as the queen reaches the last peg. Just immediately moving much, much faster than Alice could ever see. Yeah, this chessboard motif did not make it into didn't quite make it into the Disney movie, but a lot of the several of the characters did. Tweedledum and Tweedledee are kind of a very familiar part of the film. Sorry, I'm pouring myself some water. There was actually, so the mock turtle is something that comes up in the first book. And believe it or not, there was actually a cut scene from the Disney movie that was actually based around the mock turtle. It just didn't make it for one reason or another. What those one or another reasons are, I don't quite know off the top of my head, but I know it was a thing. There was also one with the... No, the mock turtle was the one that was telling a story in the round, and that's what got cut. Welcome back, Arnell. Hello. Oh. I'm just letting some tea steep, and I grabbed some water between chapters here. Is everything on fire? Nothing's on fire. Very good. I always love to open my phone and find that nothing's on fire. Very good, very good. I need a timer for this tea so I don't oversteep it. And that will do. I've got about 3 minutes to vamp. Too horrifying? Perhaps, actually. I mean, given, the way the way that scene goes in the original book, I would not be shocked if they were like, this is too dark. Even if they kind of, gave it a, a nice little Disney screen print to lighten it up, it's still, it's still pretty wild and could have come out too dark and too horrifying. Alice has a lot of moments that are just like very startling to especially, the young target audience. But yeah, you can kind of see as I'm reading this, the little like how much the Disney movie is just kind of a patchwork of both the books at once. The chessboard motif isn't very well established in the film, but like there's still that kind of sense of a meandering, wandering path that makes no sense, and like the Red Queen comes up, and Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and I find it very interesting, that they kind of crammed the two books together, so to speak. What's really funny is there's actually a Mickey Mouse short based very directly on this book. My mom was afraid of the Disney Alice in Wonderland. That's fair. I saw it at a very young age, and I was like, clearly this is unsettling. Magnus. Hi. I get to shame you on stream now because you've been digging too much. Hello, sir. Come here. Come here. The internet wants to see you. I got you. I got you. Problems, man. It freaked her out as a child. That's fair. Problems, man. Look at this man. So full of problems. So full of problems. Yeah. Maybe don't dig at the food while Dad's talking to the internet, huh? Yeah, okay. Only little shame for the internet today. Because I'm feeling nice. He's gonna be all mad at me tonight because he's been. So I have their food dish and it kind of like auto feeds because my brain is a sieve, and so I have to have them on an auto feeder so I don't accidentally forget to feed them in the way that I accidentally forget to feed myself. Uh, but the problem with that is there's just constantly a bowl of food, and this one, Magnus, the one I was just holding, he does not like that, and so he sits there and tries to bury the food to hide it from something. Uh, so when he does not listen to me when I tell him to stop digging, and sometimes he does actually listen, to give him fair points. Just when he doesn't listen, I sometimes pick him up and shame him just like that. Sometimes I hold him and do squats, but not on stream. I've done plenty of on stream exercise, I would think. What with the ring fit, whatnot. Tigo Burr. This is a really lovely rose oolong that I opened the other night on stream. It's just like it's just like a pretty nice oolong tea that also happens to have some rose petals in it. And I quite care for it. I was like, hesitating on opening it, like, oh, am I gonna like this? I don't know. And then I opened it and I was like, oh, this is really good. And it's interesting because usually things that are teas that are rose scented usually kind of lean on rose hips rather than roses proper, but this is rose petals. Kind of neat. Anyway, this book, just like Alice's Journey, is going to be very meandering because I'm especially easily distracted when I'm reading something I've already read many times outside of stream. Let's dive into chapter 3, Looking Glass Insects. Of course, the first thing to do was to make a grand survey of the country she was going to travel through. It's something very much like learning geography, thought Alice as she stood on tiptoe in hopes of being able to see a little further. Principal rivers, there are none. Principal mountain, I'm on the only one, but I don't think it's got any name. Principal towns, why, what are those creatures making honey down there? They can't be bees. Nobody ever saw bees a mile off, And for some time she stood silent, watching one of them that was bustling about among the flowers, poking its proboscis into them, just as if it were a regular bee. However, this was anything but a regular bee. In fact, it was an elephant, as Alice soon found out, though the idea quite took her breath away at first. What enormous flowers they must be, was her next idea. Something like cottages with the roofs taken off, stalks put to them. What quantities of honey they must make. Oh, I think I'll go down and... No, I won't just yet, she went on, checking herself, just as she was beginning to run down the hill, and trying to find some excuse for turning shy so suddenly. It'll never do to go down among them without a good long branch to brush them away, and what fun it'll be when they ask me how I like my walk. I shall say, oh, I like it well enough. Here came the favourite little toss of the head, only it was so dusty and hot, and the elephants did tease so. I think I'll go down the other way, she said after a pause. Perhaps I may visit the elephants later on. Besides, I do so want to get into the third square. So, with this excuse, she ran down the hill and jumped over the first of the 6 little brooks. Oh, the little... That series of dots is clearly supposed to be one interstitial line, but did not come across that way in the ebook. Now, Magnus, I see you walking toward the food dish. You do not need to dig. Hey, you with the toe beans. Thank you for stopping. I appreciate that very much. See what I mean? Sometimes he's a good boy. Aren't ya? Anyway. Tickets, please, said the guard, putting his head in the window. In a moment, everybody was holding out a ticket. They were about the same size as the people, and seemed to quite fill the carriage. Now then, show your ticket, child, the guard went on, looking angrily at Alice, and a great many voices all said together, like the chorus of a song, "Don't keep him waiting, child. His time is worth £1,000 a minute." "I'm afraid I haven't got one. There wasn't a ticket office where I came from." And again the chorus of voices went on. "There wasn't room for one where she came from. The land there is worth £1,000 an inch." "Don't make excuses. You should have bought one from the engine driver." And once more the chorus of voices went on with, "The man that drives the engines. Why, the smoke alone is worth £1,000 a puff." Alice thought to herself, "Then there's no use in speaking." The voices didn't join in this time, as she hadn't spoken, but to her great surprise they all thought in chorus. I hope you understand what thinking in chorus means, for I must confess, I don't know. "Oh, I'd better say nothing at all. Language is worth £1,000 a word." "I shall dream about £1,000 tonight, I know I shall." All this time... Excuse you. Are you quite done, picky boy? Buddy, you could just lay down. Fine, we'll keep reading. All this time, the guard was looking at her, first through a telescope, then through a microscope, then through an opera glass. At last, he said, "You're traveling the wrong way," and shut up the window and went away. "So young a child," said the gentleman, sitting opposite to her. He was dressed in white paper. "Ought to know which way she's going, even if she doesn't know her own name." A goat that was sitting next to the gentleman in white shut his eyes and said in a loud voice, "She ought to know her way to the ticket office, even if she doesn't know her alphabet." There was a beetle sitting next to the goat. It was a very queer carriage full of passengers altogether, and as the rule seemed to be that they should all speak in turn, he went on with, "She'll have to go back from here as luggage." Alice couldn't see who was sitting beyond the beetle, but a hoarse voice spoke next. "Change engines," it said, and was obliged to leave off. "Well, it sounds like a horse," Alice thought to herself, and an extremely small voice, close to her ear, said, "You might make a joke about that. Something about horse and horse, you know." Then a very gentle voice in the distance said, "She must be labeled Lass with care, you know." And after that, the other voices went on. What a number of people there are in the carriage, thought Alice, saying, "She must go by post. She's got a head on her. She must be sent as a message by the telegraph. She must draw the train and bear herself for the rest of the way," and so on. But the gentleman dressed in white paper leaned forward and whispered in her ear, "Never mind what they all say, my dear, but take a return ticket every time the train stops." "Indeed I shan't," Alice said, rather impatiently. "I don't belong to this railway journey at all. I was in a wood just now. I wish I could get back there." You might make a joke on that," the little voice said close to her ear. "Something about would if you could, you know." "Don't tease so," said Alice, looking about in vain to see where the voice came from. "You're so anxious to have a joke made, why don't you make one yourself?" The little voice sighed deeply. It was very unhappy, evidently, and Alice would have said something pitying to comfort it. "It would only sigh like other people," she thought. But this was such a wonderfully small sigh that she couldn't have heard it at all if it hadn't come quite close to her ear. The consequence of this was that it tickled her ear very much, and quite took off her thoughts from the unhappiness of the poor little creature. "I know you're a friend, a dear friend, an old friend. You won't hurt me, even though I am an insect." "What kind of insect?" Alice inquired a little anxiously. What she really wanted to know was whether it could sting or not, but she thought this wouldn't be quite a civil question to ask. "What, then you don't—" the little voice began, when it was drowned out by a shrill scream from the engine, and everybody jumped up in alarm, Alice among the rest. The horse, who had put his head out the window, quietly drew it in and said, "It's only a brook we have to jump over." Everybody seemed satisfied with this, though Alice felt a little nervous at the idea of trains jumping at all. However, it'll take us out of the fourth square. That's some comfort, she said to herself. In another moment, she felt the carriage rise straight up into the air, and in her fright, she caught at the thing nearest to her head, which happened to be the goat's beard. But the beard seemed to melt away as she touched it, and she found herself sitting quietly under a tree, while the goat, for that was the insect she'd been talking to, was balancing itself on a twig just over her head and fanning her with its wings. Oh, the gnat. I can read. Yeah, well, the gnat, not the goat. Y'all can see how I can misread an N as no, right? I just got these new glasses. I should not be that blind. Apologies. It certainly was a very large gnat, about the size of a chicken. That's a big gnat. Still, she couldn't feel nervous with it, after they'd been talking together so long. So then you don't like all insects? The gnat went on, as quietly as if nothing had happened. I like them when they can talk. Well, none of them ever talk where I come from. What sort of insects do you rejoice in where you come from? I don't rejoice in insects at all, because I'm rather afraid of them. At least the large kinds, but I can tell you the names of some of them. Of course they answer to their names. I never knew them to do it. What's the use of them having names if they won't answer to them? No use to them, but it's useful to the people who name them, I suppose. If not, why do things have names at all? I can't say. Further on, in the wood down there, they've got no names. However, go on with your list of insects. You're wasting time. Well, there's the horsefly, Alice began, counting names off on her fingers. All right, halfway up that bush, you'll see a rocking horsefly if you look. It's made entirely of wood and gets about by swinging itself from branch to branch. What's it live on? Alice asked with great curiosity. Sap and sawdust. Go on with the list. Alice looked up at the rocking horse-fly with great interest, and made up her mind that it must have just been repainted. It looked so bright and sticky. Then she went on. And then there's the dragonfly. And look on that branch above your head, and you'll find the snapdragonfly. Its body is made of plum pudding, its wings of holly leaves, and its head is a raisin burning in brandy. That's not what I was expecting when they were like, oh, it's a snapdragon fly. I was expecting the snapdragon, like, the flower. You know, the little flower that you can kind of, like, squish, and it goes, that was my first thought, not, like, a plum pudding. I guess a snapdragon might be another name for, like, a British Christmas confectionery, given the description here. What does it live on? Fruity mince pie. Makes its nest in a Christmas box. That's absolutely. Then snapdragons are a Christmas thing. Oh, and then there's the butterfly, Alice went on, after she'd taken a good look at the insect with its head on fire, and thought to herself, I wonder if that's the reason insects are so fond of flying into candles, because they want to turn into snapdragon flies. Crawling at your feet, said the gnat, Alice drawing her feet back in some alarm. You may observe a bread and butterfly. Its wings are thin slices of bread and butter, its body is a crust, and its head is a lump of sugar. What does it live on? Weak tea with cream in it. Bread and butterflies are one that made it into the Disney movie, I think. I haven't watched it in a good while, come to think. Anyway, a new difficulty came into Alice's head. Supposing it couldn't find any? Well, then it would die, of course. Oh, but that must happen very often. It always happens. After this, Alice was silent for a moment or two, pondering. The gnat amused itself meanwhile by humming round and round her head. At last it had settled again, and remarked, I suppose you don't want to lose your name? No, indeed, Alice said a little anxiously. Yet I don't know, the gnat went on in a careless tone. Only think how convenient it would be if you could manage to go home without it. For instance, if the excuse me, Nat's having a bad time with things apparently. For instance, if the governess wanted to call you to your lessons, she would call out, "Come over here." Then she'd have to leave off because there wouldn't be any name for her to call. Of course, you wouldn't have to go, you know. Oh, that would never do, I'm sure. The governess would never think of excusing me for lessons for that. If she couldn't remember my name, she'd call me Mrs. The servants do. Well, if she said Miss and didn't say anything more, of course you'd miss your lessons. Oh, that's a joke. I wish you'd made it. Why do you wish I'd made it? It's a very bad one. But the gnat sighed deeply, while two large tears came rolling down its cheeks. You shouldn't make jokes if it makes you so unhappy. Then there came another of those melancholy little sighs. Oh. And this time the poor gnat really seemed to have sighed itself away, for when Alice looked up there was nothing whatsoever to be seen on the twig. She was getting quite chilly while sitting still for so long. She got up and walked on. She very soon came to an open field with a wood on the other side of it. It looked much darker than the last wood, and Alice felt a little timid about going into it. However, on second thoughts, she made up her mind to go on. For I certainly won't go back, she thought to herself, and this was the only way to the 8th square. This must be the wood, she said thoughtfully to herself, where things have no names. I wonder what'll become of my name when I go in. I shouldn't like to lose it, because then they'd have to give me another, and it almost would be certainly an ugly one. And the fun would be trying to find the creature that got my old name. That's just like advertisements, you know, when people lose dogs, answers to the name of Dash, it's hat on a brass collar. Just fancy calling everything you met Alice till one of them answered, only they wouldn't answer at all if they were wise, you see. She was rattling on in this way when she reached the wood. It looked very cool and shady. Well, at any rate, it's a great comfort, she said as she stepped under the trees. After being so hot to get into... Into what? She went on, rather surprised at not being able to think of the word. I mean, to get under the... Under this, you know, she said, putting her hand on the trunk of the tree. What does it call itself, I wonder? I do believe it's got no name. Why, to be sure, it hasn't. She stood silent for a minute, thinking, and then suddenly began again. Then it really has happened after all. Now who am I? I will remember if I can. I'm determined to do it. But being determined didn't help much. All she could do was say, after a great deal of puzzling, was, L? I just know it begins with L. Just then a fawn came wandering by. It looked at Alice with its large, gentle eyes, but didn't seem at all frightened. Here then, Alice said as she held out her hand and tried to stroke it, but it only started back a little, and then stood looking at her again. What do you call yourself? The fawn said at last. Such a soft, sweet voice it had. Oh, I wish I knew, thought poor Alice. She answered rather sadly, Nothing just now. Well, think again. That won't do. Alice thought, but nothing came of it. Please, would you tell me what you call yourself? I think that might help a little. I'll tell you if you move a little further on. I can't remember here. So they walked on together through the wood, Alice with her arms clasped lovingly round the soft neck of the fawn, till they came out into another open field, and here the fawn gave a sudden bound into the air and shook itself free from Alice's arms. I'm a fawn! It cried out in a voice of delight. Dear me, you're a human child! A sudden look of alarm came into its beautiful brown eyes, and in another moment it had darted away at full speed. Alice stood looking after it, almost ready to cry with vexation after having lost her dear little fellow-traveller so suddenly. However, I know my name now. That's some comfort. Alice. Alice! I won't forget it again. Now which of these finger posts I ought to follow, It wasn't a very difficult question to answer. There was only one road through the wood, and the two little finger posts both pointed along it. I'll settle it when the road divides, and they point different ways. But this didn't seem likely to happen. She went on and on a long way, but wherever the road divided there were sure to be two finger posts pointing the same way, one marked to Tweedledum's house, and the other to the house of Tweedledee. I do believe they live in the same house. I wonder if I never thought of that before, but I can't stay there long. I'll just call out and say how do you do, and ask them the way out of the wood. If only I could get to the 8th square before it gets dark." So she wandered on, talking to herself as she went, till, upon turning a sharp corner, she came upon 2 fat little men. Boom, boom. So suddenly she could not help starting back, but in another moment she recovered herself, feeling sure that they must be Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Ugh. This is really quite good. I should it'd be really fun. Kind of have like a little bit of a tea party, especially appropriate for this book. Maybe I can find a few more that have that same sort of energy. Fall has kind of worked its way over here, and it might actually be appropriate to fetch the teapot out of the cabinet. Hopefully, it's survived. Last time I was using it, it kind of had cracked a little bit because I hadn't quite packed it well enough. But we'll see. Hopefully it's managed by now. You know. The trouble is, this is already kind of cooled. I was so zoned in. Anyway, chapter 4: Tweedledum and Tweedledee. They were standing under a tree, each with an arm round the other's neck, and Alice knew which one was which in a moment, because one of them had "Dum" embroidered on his collar, and the other had "D." "I suppose they've each got Tweedle round the back of each collar," she said to herself. They stood so still she quite forgot they were alive, and she was just looking round to see if the word "Tweedle" was written in the back of each collar, when she was startled by a voice coming from the one marked "Dum." If you think we're waxworks, you ought to pay, you know. Waxworks weren't made to be looked at for nothing, you know."
"Contrariwise," added the one marked D, "if you think we're alive, you ought to speak."
"I'm sure I'm very sorry," was all Alice could say, for the words of the old song kept ringing through her head like the ticking of a clock. She could hardly help saying them out loud. Tweedledum, Tweedledee agreed to have a battle, for Tweedledum said Tweedledee had spoiled his nice new rattle. Just then flew down a monstrous crow as black as a tar barrel, which frightened both the heroes so they quite forgot their quarrel. I feel like I said one or two of those words wrong for the rhyme scheme, but we take this.
"I know what you're talking about, but it isn't so, nohow."
"Contrariwise, if it was so, it might be, and if it were so, it would be, but it isn't, it ain't. That's the logic of the situation."
"I was thinking, which is the best way out of the wood? It's getting so dark. Would you tell me, please?" But the little men only looked at each other and grinned. They looked so exactly like a couple of great schoolboys that Alice couldn't help pointing her finger at Tweedledum and saying, "First boy!"
"Nohow,"
Tweedledum cried out briskly and shut his mouth up again with a snap. "Next boy," said Alice, passing on to Tweedledee, though she felt quite certain he would only shout "Contrariwise," and so on. He did.
"Contrariwise."
"You have been wrong. The first thing in a visit is to say how do you do and shake hands,"
cried Tweedledum. And here the two brothers gave each other a hug. Then they held out the 2 hands that were free to shake hands with her. Alice did not like shaking hands with either of them first, for fear of hurting the other one's feelings. So as the best way out of the difficulty, she took hold of both hands at once. The next moment they were dancing round in a ring. This seemed quite natural as she recalled it, and she was not even surprised to hear music playing. Seemed to come from under the tree which they were dancing, and it was done, well she could make out, by the branches rubbing across each other, like fiddles and fiddlesticks. "Oh, but it certainly was funny," Alice said afterwards, when she was telling her sister the history of all this, "to find myself here we go round the mulberry bush. I didn't know when I began it, but somehow I felt as if I'd been singing it a long, long time." The other 2 dancers were fat and very soon out of breath.
4 times round is enough for one dance,"
Tweedledum panted out, and they left off dancing as suddenly as they'd begun. The music stopped at the same moment. Then they let go of Alice's hands and stood looking at her for a minute. There was a rather awkward pause, as Alice didn't know how to begin a conversation with people she'd just been dancing with. It would never do to say how do you do now. We seem to have much gone beyond that how. I hope you're not much tired?
No, how, and thank you very much for asking.
So much obliged. You like poetry?
Yes, pretty well. Some poetry, Alice said doubtfully. Would you tell me which road leads out of the wood?
What shall I repeat it to her?
Said Tweedledee, looking round at Tweedledum with great solemn eyes, and not noticing Alice's question.
The Walrus and the Carpenter is the longest.
Tweedledum replied, giving his brother an affectionate hug. Tweedledee began instantly. The sun was shining. Here Alice ventured to interrupt him. If it's very long, she said, politely as she could, would you please tell me first which road? Tweedledee smiled gently and began again.
The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright, and this was odd because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily, because she thought the sun had no business to be there after day was done. It's very rude of him, she said, to come and spoil the fun. The sea was wet as wet could be, the sands were dry as dry. You could not see in a cloud, because no cloud was in the sky. No birds were flying overhead, there were no birds to fly. The Walrus and the Carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. If only this were cleared away, they said, it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you suppose, the Walrus said, they could get that they could get it clear? I doubt it, said the Carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. Oh, oysters, come and walk with us, the Walrus did beseech. A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk along the briny beach. We cannot do with more than 4 to give a hand to each. The eldest oyster looked at him, but never a word he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head, meaning to say he did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat. And this was odd, because, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed them, and yet another 4, and thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The Walrus and the Carpenter walked on a mile or so, and then they raised on a rock conveniently low. And all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. The time has come, the Walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings. But wait a bit, the oysters cried, before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath and all of us are fat. And no hurry, said the Carpenter. They thanked him much for that. A loaf of bread, the Walrus said, is what we chiefly need. Pepper and vinegar, besides, are very good indeed. Now, if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin to feed. But not on us, the oysters cried, turning a little blue. After such kindness, that would be a dismal thing to do. The night is fine, the Walrus said. Do you admire the view? It was so kind of you to come, and you are so very nice. The Carpenter said nothing, but cut us another slice. I wish you were not quite so deaf. I've had to ask you twice. It seems a shame, the Walrus said, to play them such a trick, after we've brought them out so far and made them trot so quick. The Carpenter said nothing, but the butter spread too thick. I weep for you, the Walrus said. I deeply sympathize. With sobs and tears he sorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streamy eyes. Oh, oysters, said the Carpenter, you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again? But answer there came none, and that was scarcely odd, because they'd eaten every one. I feel like I can't recall where this line in particular. Oh, you can see the highlighting I'm making. Very nice. I didn't know that would work. To talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings.
and why the sea is boiling hot and whether pigs have wings. I feel like that has come up somewhere in pop culture. I feel like maybe it was like nodded at by the Dormouse, maybe in the Disney movie? Question mark. It feels familiar. It has a very specific cadence that, like, that whole thing kind of has a very familiar cadence to me, but like that line especially uh sticks out in my brain. I feel like it has been nodded at by something. Sorry, that very nasally voice was beginning to grate on me, so I'm glad I got through that. Anyway. I like the walrus best, said Alice, because you see he was a little sorry for the poor oysters.
He ate more than the carpenter, though. You see, he held his handkerchief in front, so the carpenter couldn't count how many he took, contrariwise.
That was mean. And I like the carpenter best, if he didn't eat so many as the walrus.
But he ate as many as he could get.
This was a puzzler. After a pause, Alice began, Well, they were both very unpleasant characters. Here she checked herself in some alarm at hearing something that sounded to her like the puffing of a large steam engine in the wood near them, though she feared it was more likely to be a wild beast. Are there any lions or tigers about here?
Oh, it's only the Red King snoring.
Come and look at him, the brothers cried, and they each took one of Alice's hands and led her up to where the king was sleeping.
Isn't he a lovely sight?
Said Tweedledum. Alice couldn't say honestly that he was. He had a tall red nightcap on with a tassel, and he was lying crumpled up into a sort of untidy heap and snoring loud, fit to snore his head off, as Tweedledum remarked. I'm afraid he'll catch cold lying on that damp grass, said Alice, who was a very thoughtful little girl. He's dreaming now. What do you think he's dreaming about? Well, nobody can guess that.
Why about you?
Tweedledee exclaimed, clapping his hands triumphantly.
If he left off dreaming about you, where do you think you'd suppose he'd be?
Where I am now, of course.
Not you,
Tweedledee retorted contemptuously.
You'd be nowhere. Why, you're only sort of thing in his dream. If that there king was to wake, you'd go out bang, just like a candle.
Oh, I shouldn't, Alice exclaimed indignantly. Besides, if I'm only a sort of thing in his dream, what are you, I should like to know?
Ditto.
Ditto, ditto,
cried Tweedledee. Apparently Tweedledum and Tweedledee have a favorite Pokemon. Sorry, that was right there. I had to go for it. He shouted this so loud that Alice couldn't help saying, Hush! You'll wake him. I'm afraid if you make so much noise.
Well, it's no use you're talking about waking him. But when you're only one of the things in his dream, you know very well you're not real.
I am real, said Alice, and began to cry. I, too, would probably start crying if someone very earnestly described me as not a real thing. Like, that's a dire insult.
You won't make yourself a bit realer by crying. There's nothing to cry about.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know that was gonna squeak.
If I wasn't real,
Alice said, half laughing through her tears. It all seems so ridiculous. I shouldn't be able to cry.
Oh, I hope you don't suppose those are real tears.
Tweedledum interrupted in a tone of real contempt. I know they're talking nonsense, Alice thought to herself. It's foolish to cry about it. So she brushed away her tears and went on as cheerfully as she could. At any rate, I should be getting out of the wood, for really it's coming on very dark. You think it's going to rain? Tweedledum spread a large umbrella over himself and his brother and looked up into it.
No, I don't think it is. At least, not under here, nohow.
Then may it rain outside?
It may, if it chooses. We've no objection, contrariwise.
Selfish things, thought Alice, and she was going to say good night and leave them when Tweedledum sprang out from under the umbrella and seized her by the wrist. "Do you see that?" he said in a voice choked with passion, his eyes growing large and yellow all in a moment, as he pointed with a trembling finger at a small white thing lying under the tree. "Well, it's only a rattle," Alice said, after a careful examination of the little white thing. "Not a rattlesnake, you know," she said, hastily, thinking that he was frightened. "Only an old rattle, quite old and broken."
I knew it was,
cried Tweedledum, beginning to stamp about wildly and tear his hair.
"It's spoiled, of course."
Here he looked at Tweedledee, who immediately sat down on the ground and tried to hide himself under the umbrella. Alice laid her hand upon his arm and said in a soothing tone, "You needn't be so angry about an old rattle."
"What is it? But it isn't old,"
Tweedledum cried in a greater fury than ever.
"It's new, I tell you. I bought it yesterday, my nice new rattle!"
And his voice rose to a perfect scream. All this time Tweedledee was trying his best to fold up the umbrella with himself in it, which was such an extraordinary thing to do that it quite took off Alice's attention from the angry brother. But he couldn't quite succeed, and it ended in his rolling over, bundled up in the umbrella with only his head out, and there he lay, opening and shutting his mouth, and his large eyes looking nothing more like a fish than anything else.
"Of course you agree to have a battle?"
I suppose so,
The other sulkily replied as he crawled out of the umbrella.
only she must help us to dress up, you know.
So the two brothers went off hand in hand into the wood, and returned in a minute with their arms full of things such as bolsters, blankets, hearth rugs, tablecloths, dish covers, coal scuttles.
I hope you're a good...
I hope you're a good hand at pinning and tying things. Every one of these things has got to go on somehow or another.
Alice said afterward she'd never seen such a fuss made about anything in all her life. The way those two bustled about, and the quantity of things they put on, and the trouble they gave her in tying strings and fastening buttons. Really, they'd be more like bundles of old clothes than anything else by the time they're ready, she said to herself, as she arranged a bolster round the neck of Tweedledee to keep his head from being cut off, as he said.
You know, he added very gravely, it's one of the most serious things that could possibly happen to one in a battle to get one's head cut off.
Alice laughed aloud, but she managed to turn it into a cough for fear of hurting his feelings.
"Do I look very pale?"
said Tweedledum, coming up to have a helmet tied on. He called it a helmet, though it certainly looked much more like a saucepan.
Well, yes, a little.
"I'm very brave, generally,"
He went on in a low voice.
"Only today I happen to have a headache."
And I've got a toothache,
said Tweedledee, who overheard the remark.
I'm far worse off than you.
Then you'd better not fight today, said Alice, thinking it a good opportunity to make peace.
"Oh, we must have a bit of a fight, but I don't care about going on so long. What's the time now?"
Tweedledee looked at his watch and said,
Half past 4.
"Let's fight till 6, then have dinner."
Very well. And she can watch us, only you'd better not come very close. I generally hit everything I can see when I get really excited.
"And I hit everything in reach, whether I can see it or not."
Alice laughed. Oh, you must hit the trees pretty often, I should think. Tweedledum looked around him with a satisfied smile.
"I don't suppose there'll be a tree left standing for ever so far round by the time we've finished."
And all about the rattle, said Alice, hoping to make them a little ashamed of fighting for such a trifle. Ah, entirely fair, Arnell. Do enjoy your sleep. I am always happy to hear that I may or may not have people, lulled people to sleep. You know, I'm at the right time of night to be a bedtime story for some people. Anyway,
"I shouldn't have minded so much if it hadn't been a new one."
I wish the monstrous crow would come, thought Alice.
"There's only one sword, you know."
Tweedledum said to his brother.
"Oh, but you can have the umbrella. It's quite as sharp. We must begin quickly. It's getting as dark as it can.
And darker.
It was getting dark, so suddenly that Alice thought there must be a thunderstorm coming on. What a thick black cloud that is, she said. And how fast it comes. Why, I do believe it has wings.
Here's the crow!
Tweedledum cried out in a shrill voice of alarm, and the two brothers took to their heels and were out of sight in a moment. Alice ran a little way into the wood and stopped under a large tree. It can never get at me here. It's far too large to squeeze itself in amongst the trees. Oh, but I wish it wouldn't flap its wings so. It makes quite a hurricane in the wind. Here's somebody's shawl being blown away. Chapter 5. Wool and Water. Now, before we dive into that, enjoy your sleep hour now. I hope you have a great evening, and I'll see you around. I usually wind up seeing you around. Anyway, she caught the shawl as she spoke and looked about for the owner. In another moment, the White Queen came running wildly through the wood, with both arms stretched out wide as if she were flying, and Alice very civilly went to meet her with a shawl. "I'm very glad I happened to be in the way," Alice said as she helped her to put on her shawl again. The White Queen only looked at her in a helpless, frightened sort of way, and kept repeating something in a whisper to herself that sounded like bread and butter, bread and butter. And Alice felt as that if there was to be any conversation at all, she must manage it by herself. So she began rather timidly, "Am I addressing the White Queen?" "Yeah, night hour now. Have a good evening." "Well, yes, if you call that addressing. It isn't my notion of the thing after all," the Queen said. Alice thought that it would never do to have an argument at the very beginning of their conversation, so she smiled and said, "If your Majesty will only tell me the right way to begin, I'll do it as well as I can."
"But I don't want it done at all,"
groaned the poor Queen.
"I've been addressing myself for the past 2 hours."
It would have been all the better, as it seemed to Alice, if she had got someone else to dress her. She was so dreadfully untidy. Every single thing's crooked, Alice thought, and she's all over pins. "May I put your shawl straight for you?" she added aloud.
"I don't know what's the matter with it,"
the Queen said in a melancholy voice.
"It's out of temper. I think I've pinned it here and pinned it there, but there's no pleasing it. It can't go straight, you know."
It can't go straight, you know, if you pin it all on one side," Alice said as she gently put it right for her. "Dear me, what a state your hair's in." "Oh, the brush has gotten entangled in it," the Queen said with a sigh.
"And I lost the comb yesterday."
Alice carefully released the brush and did her best to get the hair into order. "Oh, come, you look better now," she said after altering most of the pins. "But really, you should have a lady's maid." "I'm sure I'll take you with pleasure. 2 pence a week. Jam every other day?" Alice couldn't help laughing as she said, I don't want you to hire me. I don't care for jam."
"But it's very good jam."
"I don't want any today, at any rate."
You couldn't have it if you did want it. The rule is jam tomorrow, jam yesterday, but never jam today."
"Well, it must come sometimes, the jam today."
"No, it can't. It's jam every other day. But today isn't any other day, you know."
"I don't understand you. It's dreadfully confusing."
"That's the effect of living backwards. It always makes one a little giddy at first."
"Living backwards?" Alice repeated in great astonishment. "Never heard of such a thing."
"Oh, there's one great advantage in it. My apologies, I've lost my words. There's one great advantage in it, and that's that one's memories work both ways."
"I'm sure mine only works one way. I can't remember things before they happen."
"It's a poor sort of memory that only works backwards."
"What sort of things do you remember best?" Alice ventured to ask.
"Oh, things that happened the week after next,"
the Queen replied in a careless tone.
"Oh, for instance now,"
she went on, sticking a large piece of plaster on her finger as she spoke,
"there's the King's messenger. He's in prison now, being punished. The trial doesn't even begin till next Wednesday. And of course the crime comes last of all."
Well, suppose he never commits the crime. It would be all the better, wouldn't it? The Queen said as she bound the plaster round her finger with a bit of ribbon. Alice felt there was no denying that. Well, of course it would be all the better, but wouldn't it be all the better to his being... It wouldn't be all the better on him being punished. Oh, you're all there, at any rate. Were you ever punished? Only for my faults. And you were all the better for it, I know. Yes, but then I had done the things I was punished for. That makes all the difference, doesn't it? Oh, but if you hadn't done them, that would have been better still, better and better and better. Her voice went higher with each better, till it got quite to a squeak at last. Alice was just beginning to say, "There's a mistake somewhere," when the Queen began screaming so loud that she had to leave the sentence unfinished. Shouted the Queen, shaking her hand about as if she wanted to shake it off. "My finger's bleeding!" Her scream was so exactly like the whistle of a steam engine that Alice had to hold both her hands over her ears. "What is the matter?" she said, as soon as there was a chance of making herself heard. "Have you pricked your finger?" "I haven't pricked it yet, but I shall. Where do you expect to do it?" Alice asked, feeling very much inclined to laugh. "When I fasten my shawl again," the poor Queen groaned out. "The brooch will come down undone directly. Brooch, rather. Oh, I'm losing my pronunciation, this darn memory. I can never get straight which way it goes." As she said the words, the brooch flew open, and the Queen clutched wildly at it, trying to clasp it again. "Oh, take care, you're holding it all crooked. And she caught at the brooch, but it was too late. The pin had slipped, and the Queen had pricked her finger. "That accounts for the bleeding, you see," she said to Alice with a smile. "And now you understand the way things happen here." "Why don't you scream now?" Alice asked, holding her hands ready to get over her ears again. "I have done all the screaming already. What would be the good of doing it all over again?" By this time it was getting light. "The crow must have flown away, I think," said Alice. "I'm so glad it's gone. I thought it was the night coming on. I wish I could be managed to be glad. Oh, only I can never remember the rule. You must be very happy, living in this wood, being glad whenever you like." "Oh, only it is so very lonely here," Alice said in a melancholy voice. At the thought of her loneliness, 2 large tears came rolling down her cheeks. "Oh, don't go on like that!" cried the poor Queen, wringing her hands in despair. "Consider what a great girl you are. Consider what a long way you've come today. Consider what o'clock it is. Consider anything, really. Just don't cry." Alice could not help laughing at this, even in the midst of her tears. "Oh, can you keep from crying by considering things?" "That's the way it's done," the Queen said with great decision. "Nobody can do 2 things at once, you know. Let's consider your age to begin with. How old are you?" "I'm 7½ exactly." "Oh, you needn't say exactually. I can believe it without that. Now I'll give you something to believe. I'm just 101 5 months and a day." "I can't believe that." "Oh, can't you? Try again. Draw a long breath. Shut your eyes." "There's no use trying. One can't believe impossible things." "Well, I dare say you haven't much practice. When I was your age, we always did it for half an hour a day. I'd believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Oh, there goes the shawl again." "I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast" has 100% been quoted by someone or something. At some point. I 100% recognize that line. Maybe just because it kind of, it's a very memorable line. It's very sticky to my brain. But, who knows? I might be wrong. Anyway, the brooch had come undone as she spoke, and a sudden gust of wind blew the Queen's shawl across a little brook. The Queen spread out her arms again and went flying after it, and this time she succeeded in catching it for herself. "I've got it! Now you shall see me put it on again all by myself." "And then I hope your finger is better now?" Alice said very politely. She crossed the little brook after the queen.
Oh, much better,
Cried the queen, her voice rising to a squeak as she went on.
much
The last word ended in a high, long bleat, so much like a sheep that Alice quite started. She looked at the queen, who seemed to have suddenly wrapped herself up in wool. Alice rubbed her eyes and looked again. She couldn't make out what had happened at all. Was she really in a shop? Was that really a sheep that was sitting on the other side of the counter? Rub as she might, she could make nothing more of it. She was in a little dark shop, leaning with her elbows on the counter, and opposite to her was an old sheep, sitting in an armchair, knitting, every now and then leaving off to look at her through a great pair of spectacles. What is it if you want to buy? The sheep said at last, looking up for a moment from her knitting. I don't quite know yet. I should like to look around me first, if I might. You may look in front of you and on both sides if you like, but you can't look all around you unless you've got some eyes in the back of your head, you see. But these, as it happened, Alice had not got, so she contented herself with turning round, looking at the shelves as she came to them. The shop seemed to be full of all manner of curious things, but the oddest part of it was, well, that whenever she looked hard at any shelf to make out exactly what it had on it, that particular shelf was always quite empty, though the others around it were crowded as full as they could hold. Things flow about so here. Oh, things flow about so much here, she said at last, in a plaintive tone, after she'd spent about a minute or so vainly pursuing a large bright thing that sometimes looked like a doll, sometimes like a work box. It was always sitting in the shelf above the one she was looking at. And this is the one most provoking of all, I'll tell you what, she added, as a sudden thought struck her. I'll follow it up to the very top shelf of it all. It'll puzzle it to go through the ceiling, I expect. But even this plan failed. The thing went through the ceiling quietly as possible, as if it were quite used to it. Are you a child or a teetotum? The sheep said as she took up another pair of needles. You'll make me giddy soon if you keep turning around like that. Teetotum has to be another word for a top, right? Like, spinning top. Let's ask Google. Teetotum. Tell me, mighty internet, a small spinning top, spun with the fingers, especially one with 4 sides lettered to determine whether the spinner has won or lost. Oh, it's another word for dreidel. That was my immediate thought. Was, oh, it's a dreidel, because a dreidel has 4 sides, and you spin it with your fingers, and depending on what comes up, you play the game. Anyway. She was now working with 14 pairs at once, and Alice couldn't help looking at her in great astonishment. How can she knit so many? The puzzled child thought to herself. She gets more and more like a porcupine every minute. Can you row? The sheep asked, handing her a pair of knitting needles as she spoke. Yes, a little, but not on land and not with needles, Alice was beginning to say when suddenly the needles turned into oars in her hands, and she found they were in a little boat gliding along between banks, so there was nothing to it but to do her best. Oh, sorry. My dinner is disagreeing with me for a moment there. Feather, cried the sheep as she took up another pair of needles. This didn't sound like a remark that needed any answer, so Alice said nothing but pulled away. There was something very queer about the water, she thought, as every now and then the oars got fast in it and would hardly ever come out again. Feather, Feather! The sheep cried again, taking more needles. You'll be catching a crab directly. A dear little crab, I should like that. Didn't you hear me say feather? The sheep cried angrily, taking up quite a bunch of needles. Indeed, I did. You've said it very often and very loudly. Please, where are the crabs?
In the water, of course, sticking some of the needles into her hair as her hands were full. Feather, I say.
Why do you say feather so often? Alice asked at last, rather vexed. I'm not a bird.
You are. You're a little goose.
This offended Alice a little, so there was no more conversation for a minute or two, while the boat glided gently on, sometimes among the beds of weeds, which made the oars stick fast in the water worse than ever, and sometimes under trees, but always with the same tall river banks frowning over their heads.
Oh, please, these are some scented rushes,
Alice cried in sudden transport of delight.
They really are, and such beauties. Well, you needn't see pleased to me about them, said the sheep, without looking up from her knitting. I didn't put them there, and I'm not going to take them away. No, but I meant, please, maybe wait and pick some, if you don't mind stopping the boat for a minute.
Alice pleaded.
How am I to stop it? If you leave off rowing, it'll stop itself, said the sheep.
And so the boat was left to drift down the stream as it would, till it glided gently among the waving rushes. Then the little sleeves were carefully rolled up, and the little arms were plunged in elbow deep to get the rushes a good long way down before breaking them off. And for a while Alice forgot all about the sheep and the knitting as she bent over the side of the boat, with just the ends of her tangled hair dripping into the water, while with bright, eager eyes she caught at one bunch after another of the darling scented rushes.
I only hope the boat won't topple over, she said to herself. Oh, what a lovely one, only I couldn't quite reach it.
And it certainly did seem a little provoking, almost as if it happened on purpose, she thought, that though she managed to pick plenty of beautiful rushes as the boat glided by, there was always a more lovely one that she couldn't quite reach.
The prettiest are always further,
she said at last, with a sigh at the obstinacy of the rushes and growing so far off. With flushed cheeks and dripping hair and hands, she scrambled back into her place and began to arrange her new-found treasures. What mattered it to her just then that the rushes had begun to fade, to lose all their scent and beauty from the very moment she picked them? Even real scented rushes, last only a very little while, and, well, these being dream rushes, they melted away, almost like snow, as they lay in heaps at her feet. But Alice hardly noticed this. There were so many other curious things to think about. They hadn't gone much farther before the blade of one of the oars got fast in the water and wouldn't come out again, so Alice explained it afterwards. And the consequence was that the handle of it caught her under the chin, and in spite of a little series of streaks of from poor Alice, it swept her straight off the seat and down among the heap of rushes. However, she wasn't much hurt, and was soon up again. The sheep went on with her knitting all the while, just as if nothing had happened.
That was a nice crab you caught,
she remarked, as Alice got back into her place, very much relieved to find herself still in the boat.
Was it? I didn't see it,
said Alice, peeping cautiously over the side of the boat into the dark water.
I wish it hadn't let go. I should so like to see a little crab take home with me.
But the sheep only laughed scornfully and went on with her knitting.
Are there many crabs here? Crabs and all sorts of things. Plenty of choice, only make up your mind. Now what do you want to buy?
To buy? Alice echoed in a tone that was half astonished and half frightened, for the oars and the boat and the river had all vanished in a moment, and she was back again in the little dark shop.
I should like to buy an egg, please. How do you sell them? 5 pence farthing for 1, 2 pence for 2. Then 2 are cheaper than 1?
Alice said in a surprised tone, taking out her purse.
Only you must eat them both if you buy 2.
Well, then I'll buy 1, please, said Alice, as she put the money on the counter, for she thought to herself they mightn't be at all nice, The sheep took the money and put it away in a box. Then she said,
I never put things into people's hands. That would never do. You must get it yourself.
And so saying, she went off to the other end of the shop and set the egg upright on a shelf.
I wonder why it wouldn't do,
thought Alice, as she groped her way among the tables and chairs, for the shop was very dark toward the end. The egg seems to get further away the more I walk towards it. Let me see, is this a chair? It's got branches, I do declare. How very odd to find trees growing here. And actually here's a little brook. Well, this is the queerest little shop I've ever seen. And so she went on, wondering more and more at every step, as everything turned into a tree the moment she came up to it. She quite expected the egg to do the same. Okay, before we dive into the next chapter, it's been about 2 hours. Yes, I know, we've digressed a great deal, and so that 2 hours are not actually 2 hours. But I am of the firm belief that it is time for a little intermission. I'm going to take a little bit to stretch my legs, pet my cats, drink some water, maybe make a little snacky snack. I heartily suggest you all do the same thing. Most especially stretch your legs if you've been sitting along with me. We've been sitting still, listening or reading, respectively, for about 2 hours. Definitely get hydrated if you haven't been drinking along with me. Pet your animals for me. Feel free to address any petting of your animals via photo to PaperCutsPod on Twitter. uh, Take any necessary meds if you've got that kind of thing. If you've got something you've got to take before bed. Or, depending on when you're listening to this, you just need to take your meds. I like to remind people of those because they're usually relatively important. We will be back in about 15... Ooh, excuse me. We'll be back in about 15 minutes. In the meanwhile, everybody play nice. But keep one eye on the stream. It's usually not always exactly 15 minutes. It's usually just a little while. Have a good time. We'll be back with the book here in a little bit. was live. Okay. Let me just, deedly doot. Everything's fine. Everything's working. Uh, you know, what's funny? Has Disney ever done anything with Humpty Dumpty? It feels kind of like it fits perfectly in their little lexicon of fairy tales, but I don't think I can recall them ever having done something with Humpty Dumpty outside of like maybe one of those weird stray Mickey Mouse shorts that was like only released on VHS after having been a short out front of a Disney movie for like 5 seconds. One of those where it's like, ah, yes, the VHS is titled like Mickey's Camping Trip, and it's just a bunch of like random Mickey Mouse shorts, and like they chose the camping trip one to be the cover item. Yes, I am speaking of a very specific VHS that I remember watching as a child, which annoyingly, that VHS was not in its case as I was digitizing my VHSs, so I just don't know where it is. It's just gone forever. Also, if you ever wind up seeing the things I have on my Plex server, I guarantee you most, if not all, of the Disney items in my Plex server that I have sitting on my hard drive are rips from my childhood VHSs. There's like one or two that I pulled off of a DVD, but like 99% of them are just me, time shifting the VHS off of a VHS onto my computer. And so they have a very specific quality to them, which is actually really, really nostalgic for me, personally, because it's like, it's an analog piece of media, and so it experiences degradation in its own little unique way every time you watch it. And so as the plays have accumulated on this, I get more and more of like, oh yeah, this is a specific way it like warbles or something, and it's very like, it warms my little heart that it's the same way still even now. One that I kind of wish was still on VHS, but I didn't catch off of VHS. I had to get it off of a DVD. Was Mary Poppins, which I adored Mary Poppins as a kid. Like, I don't know if I've ever mentioned this on stream, but I watched Mary Poppins so much as a kid that I wore out 2 VHS tapes. Not just one, but 2. Most kids, they kind of latch on to something, and if they're of the right age to have been watching it on a VHS tape, most parents can go, "Oh yeah, you wore out a VHS tape." No, I wore out 2. I was very stuck on that movie. And so my parents kind of roll their eyes anytime it's been being played anymore, but I was very fond of it. I still am very fond of it. I was watching it the other day just because I was having a real rough day, and it's so nice. Like, admittedly, I am very miffed about the fact that I don't have a VHS tape of it anymore, and I had to get it from DVD. But like, I do have like a cassette, like an audio cassette of the soundtrack, and that sounds exactly as I remember it because the tape has been sitting on a shelf wound for how long, so it's just fine. And like, I have been playing it back on a model of Walkman that is exactly the same as I had as a kid. And so I was just like, I was listening to it the other day, and it's like I can feel my brain turning, feeling all that little nostalgia. It makes me feel a very specific way. And like, when you're like ripping CDs onto a computer or like playing the tape back into your computer, it retains all those little bits and pieces that are the same, because it's like, if you're ripping a CD, I still use Windows Media Player for that, just because it's the tool I have on hand. And Windows Media Player, despite ripping the CD at a much faster speed than it would normally play, it still like keeps all the skips and stuff that are on the disc intact, which I didn't notice that until I was paging through uh all of my ripped media, and there's a specific song. It's off the Phantom soundtrack, and there's a specific point in Phantom that like because I listened to that because I often was listening to that CD and like it got scratched one time early on. I remember, I remember very clearly it skips right here. He repeats, a specific little motif more than once. Speaking of, I'm losing my mind. I'm going bonkers. Phantom isn't on Broadway anymore. Phantom's gonna not be on Broadway by February of next year. That's so crazy to me. Phantom has been running since the 1980s, continuously, 13,000 or more shows, and it just isn't gonna be on Broadway anymore. Like when when my partner told me the news, I like my jaw dropped, and I realized like down deep in my heart I was like, "Oh, I always wanted to see it on Broadway, and now I'm not going to be able to." It's like one of those little dreams that's kind of been like sitting up on the shelf. It's like, "Oh, Phantom will always be on Broadway. It's run since 1980, and the pandemic didn't kill it. We're fine." We're not fine. We're not fine. It's dead. Now if I want to go see Phantom on stage, I'm going to have to go all the way to the West End. That's so far. That's so much flight. And it's just, it boggles my noggle. That is. That is a thing that is happening. What's going to run in that theater? Like genuinely, I am so curious what will run after Phantom. See, if they're funny, they'll run Love Never Dies for a little while. Love Never Dies, for context, is the sequel to Phantom of the Opera that very few people like. Uh, so anyway, I digress. Let's dive back into the book, shall we? With Chapter 6, Humpty Dumpty. However, the egg only got larger and larger and more human. When she had come within a few yards of it, she saw that it had eyes and a nose and a mouth even. And she saw clearly that it was Humpty Dumpty himself. "It can't be anybody else. I'm certain of it," as if his name were written all over his face. It might have been written 100 times easily on that enormous face. Humpty Dumpty was sitting with his legs crossed like a Turk on the top of a high wall, such a narrow one that Alice quite wondered how he could keep his balance. I assume when they describe, crossed like a Turk, it's kind of like crisscross applesauce sit. I presume that's what that means. Anyway, such a narrow one that Alice quite wondered how he could keep his balance, and as his eyes were steadily fixed in the opposite direction, and he didn't take the least notice of her, she thought he must be a stuffed figure after all. "And how exactly like an egg he is," she said aloud, standing with her hands ready to catch him, for she was every moment expecting him to fall.
"It's very provoking,"
Humpty Dumpty said after a long silence, looking away from Alice as he spoke,
"to be called an egg. Very."
"I said you looked like an egg, sir, and some eggs are very pretty, you know," she added, hoping to turn her remark into a sort of compliment.
"Some people,"
Humpty Dumpty said, looking away from her as usual,
"have no more sense than a baby."
Alice didn't know what to say to this. It wasn't at all like conversation, she thought, as he never said anything to her. In fact, his last remark was so evidently addressed to a tree that she stood and softly repeated to herself, "Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty in his place again." "That last line is much too long for the poetry," she added, almost out loud, forgetting that Humpty Dumpty would hear her.
"Don't stand there chattering to yourself like that,"
Humpty Dumpty said, looking at her for the first time.
"but tell me your name and your business."
My name is Alice, but
Well, it's a stupid enough name. What's it mean?
Humpty Dumpty interrupted impatiently.
Must a name mean something?
Of course it must.
Humpty Dumpty said with a short laugh.
My name means the shape I am. Good, handsome shape it is, too. With a name like yours, you might be any shape, almost.
Why do you sit out here all alone? Alice said, not wishing to begin an argument.
Why, because there's nobody with me. Did you think I didn't know the answer to that? Ask another one.
Don't you think you'd be safer down on the ground?
Alice went on, not with any idea of making another riddle, but simply in her good-natured anxiety for the queer creature. That wall is so very narrow.
What tremendously easy riddles you ask,
Humpty Dumpty growled out.
Of course I don't think so. Why, if I ever did fall off, there's no chance of it. But if I did,
Here he pursed his lips and looked so solemn and grand that Alice could hardly help laughing.
if I did fall, the king has promised me with his very own mouth
To send all his horses and all his men?
Alice interrupted, rather unwisely.
Now I declare that's too bad,
Humpty Dumpty cried, breaking into a sudden passion.
You've been listening at doors and behind trees, down chimneys, or you couldn't have known it.
I haven't indeed. It's in a book.
Ah, well, they may write such things in a book,
Humpty Dumpty said in a calmer tone.
That's what you call a history of England, that is.
Now take a good look at me. I'm the one that's spoken to the king. I'm mayhap. I'm the one that's spoken to the king. I am. Mayhap you'll never see such another. And to show you I'm not proud, you may shake hands with me. And he grinned almost from ear to ear as he leaned forwards and nearly as possible fell off the wall in doing so, and offered Alice his hand. She watched him a little more anxiously as she took it. If he smiled much more, the ends of his mouth might meet behind him, and I don't know what had happened to his head. I'm afraid it would come off.
Yes, all his horses and all his men, they'd pick me up in a minute, they would.
However, this conversation's gone a little too fast. Let's head back to the last remark but one.
I'm afraid I can't quite remember it.
Well, in that case, we may start fresh. It's my turn to choose a subject. He talks about it like it was a game, thought Alice. So here's a question for you. How old did you say you were? Alice made a short calculation and said,
7 years and 6 months.
Wrong! Humpty Dumpty exclaimed triumphantly. You never said a word like it.
I had thought you meant how old are you?
If I'd meant that, I'd have said it. Alice didn't want to begin another argument, so she said nothing. A lot of that happening this time. 7 years and 6 months, Humpty Dumpty repeated thoughtfully. Well, that's an uncomfortable sort of age. If you'd asked my advice, I'd have said leave off at 7, but it's too late now.
I never ask advice about growing.
Are you too proud? Alice felt even more indignant at the suggestion.
I mean that one can't help growing older.
Well, one can't, perhaps, but 2 can. With the proper assistance, you might have left off at 7.
What a beautiful belt you've got on.
They had had quite enough of the subject of age, she thought, and if really they were to choose to take turns in picking subjects, it was her turn now.
At least,
she corrected herself on second thoughts.
A beautiful cravat, I should have said. No, a belt, I mean. I beg your pardon,
she asked in dismay, for Humpty Dumpty looked thoroughly offended, and she began to wish she hadn't chosen that subject. If only I knew which was neck and which was waist, she thought to herself. Evidently, Humpty Dumpty was very angry, though he said nothing for a minute or two. When he did speak again, it was in a deep growl.
It is a most provoking thing when a person doesn't know a cravat from a belt.
I know it's very ignorant of me,
she said, in so humble a tone Humpty Dumpty relented. It's a cravat, child, and a beautiful one, as you say. It's a present from the White King and Queen. There now.
Is it really?
Quite pleased to find that she had chosen a good subject after all. Well, they gave it me, Humpty Dumpty continued thoughtfully as he crossed one knee over the other and clasped his hands around it. They gave it me for an unbirthday present.
I beg your pardon?
Well, I'm not offended.
I mean, what is an unbirthday present?
A present given when it isn't your birthday, of course. Alice considered this a little.
I like birthday presents best.
Well, you don't know what you're talking about. How many days are there in a year?
365.
How many birthdays you got?
1.
And if you take 1 from 365, what remains?
364, of course.
Humpty Dumpty looked doubtful. I'd rather see that done on paper. Alice couldn't help smiling as she took out her memorandum book and worked the sum out for him. 365, 1, 364. Humpty Dumpty took the book and looked at it carefully. Well, that seems to be done right. You're holding it upside down. To be sure I was, Humpty Dumpty said gaily as she turned it round for him. I thought it looked a little queer. Well, as I was saying, that seems to be done right, though I haven't had time to look it over thoroughly just now. Shows there are 364 days and you can get unbirthday presents.
Oh, certainly.
And only 1 for birthday presents, you know. Well, there's glory for you.
I don't know what you mean by glory.
Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. Well, of course you don't till I tell you. I meant there's a nice knockdown argument for you.
But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument.
When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less.
Well, the question is whether you can make words mean so different things.
The question is which to be master, that's all. Alice was too puzzled to say anything, so after a minute Humpty Dumpty began again. They're a temper, some of them, particularly verbs. They're the proudest particularly verbs, they're the proudest. Adjectives, now, you can do anything with them, but not verbs. However, I can manage the whole lot of them. Impenetrability, that's what I say.
Would you tell me, please, what that means?
Now you talk like a reasonable child, said Humpty Dumpty, looking very much pleased. I meant by impenetrability that we've had just enough of that subject, and it'd be just as well if you'd mention what you mean to do next. I suppose you don't mean to stop here all the rest of your life.
That's a great deal to make one word mean.
When I make a word, I do a lot of work like that. I always pay it extra.
Oh!
She was too much puzzled to make any other remark. Well, you should see him come round me on a Saturday night. Humpty Dumpty went on, wagging his head gravely from side to side. Well, for to get their wages, you know. Alice didn't venture to ask what he paid them with, and so you see I can't tell you.
You seem very clever at explaining words, sir. Would you kindly tell me the meaning of the poem called Jabberwocky?
Well, let's hear it. I can explain all the poems that ever were invented. Good many that haven't been invented just yet besides.
This sounded very hopeful, so Alice repeated the first verse. "'Twas Brelig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimbled in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe."
Well, that's enough to begin with. There are plenty of hard words there. Brelig means 4 o'clock in the afternoon, time when you'd begin broiling something for dinner.
Oh, that'll do very well. And slithy?
Well, slithy means lithe and slimy. Lithe is the same as active, you see. It's like a portmanteau. There's 2 meanings packed up into one word.
I see it now. What are toves?
Well, toves are a bit like a badger, something like a lizard. There's something like a corkscrew, too.
Well, they must look very curious.
Well, they are that. They make their nests under sundials and they live on cheese.
What's the gyre and to gimble?
Well, to gyres going round and round like a gyroscope, you know, and to gimbals make holes like a gimlet.
And the wabe is the grass plot round a sundial, I suppose?
Said Alice, surprised at her own ingenuity. Well, of course it is. It's called wabe, you know, because it goes a long way for it and a long way behind it, and
a long way beyond it on each side.
Exactly so. Well, in mimsy, it's flimsy, miserable. There's another portmanteau for you. Borogove, it's a thin, shabby-looking bird, feathers sticking out all around. Something a little bit like a live mite.
Then mome raths? I'm afraid I'm giving you a great deal of trouble.
Well, wrath is a sort of green pig, but, well, mome I'm not too certain about. I think it's short for from home, and they're lost their way, you know.
Outgrabe? What about that one?
Well, outgrabing something between bellowing and whistling, kind of sneeze in the middle. You hear it done maybe down wood yonder, and once you've heard it, you'll be pretty content. Who's been repeating all them hard words to you?
Magnus. Buddy, can we not dig, maybe?
Thank you, Kitty.
I read it in a book, but I had some poetry repeated to me much easier than that by, Tweedledee, I think it was.
Well, here's to poetry, said Humpty Dumpty, stretching out one of his great hands. I can repeat poetry as well as other folk, if it comes to that.
Well, it needn't come to that,
Alice hastily said, hoping to keep him from beginning. Now, this piece I'm going to repeat, he went on without noticing a remark, was written entirely for your amusement. Alice felt that in that case she really ought to listen to it, so she sat down and said thank you, rather sadly. In winter, when the fields are white, I sing this song for your delight. But only I don't sing it, he added as an explanation.
I see you don't.
If you can see whether I'm singing or not, you've got sharper eyes than most, Humpty Dumpty remarked severely. Alice remained silent. In spring, when woods are getting green, I'll try and tell you what I mean.
Thank you very much.
In summer, when the days are long, perhaps you'll understand the song. In autumn, when the leaves are brown, take pen and ink and write it down.
I will if I can remember it so long.
Oh, you needn't go on making remarks like that. They're not sensible. You're putting me out. I sent a message to the fish. I told them this is what I wish. The little fishes of the sea, they sent an answer back to me. The little fish's answer was, we cannot do it, sir, because...
I'm afraid I quite don't understand.
It gets easier further on. I sent to them again to say, it will be better to obey. The fishes answered with a grin, why, what a temper you are in. I told them once, I told them twice, they would not listen to advice. I took a kettle large and new, fit for the deed I had to do. My heart went hop, my heart went thump, filled the kettle at the pump. Then someone came to me and said, the little fishes are in bed. I said to him, I said it plain, and you must wake 'em up again. I said it very loud and clear, I went and shouted in his ear. Humpty Dumpty raised his voice almost to a scream as he repeated this verse, and Alice thought with a shudder, I wouldn't have been the messenger for anything. But he was very stiff and proud. He said, you needn't shout so loud. And he was very proud and stiff. He said I'd go and wake them if. I took a corkscrew from the shelf. I went to wake 'em up myself. And when I found the door was locked, I pushed and pulled and kicked and knocked. And when I found the door was shut, I tried to turn the handle, but... And at this there was a long pause.
Is that all?
Well, that's all. Goodbye. This was rather sudden, Alice thought, but after such a very strong hint she ought to be going, she felt that it would hardly be civil to stay. So she got up and held out her hand.
Oh, goodbye, till we meet again.
I shouldn't know you again if we did meet, Humpty Dumpty replied in a discontented tone, giving her one of his fingers to shake. Well, you're so exactly like other people.
The face is what one goes by, generally,
Alice remarked in a thankful tone. That's just what I complain of. Your face is the same as everybody has. The 2 eyes, so... He marked the places in the air with his thumb. A nose in the middle, mouth under, it's always the same. Now, if you had the 2 eyes on the side of the nose, for instance, or mouth up top, well, that'd be some help.
Oh, but it wouldn't look nice.
But Humpty Dumpty only shut his eyes and said, well, wait till you tried. Alice waited a minute to see if he'd speak again, but as he never opened his eyes or took any further notice of her, she said, goodbye. And getting no answer to this, she quietly walked away. But she couldn't help saying to herself as she went,
of all the unsatisfactory...
She repeated this aloud, as it was a great comfort to have a long word to say.
All the unsatisfactory people I ever met.
She never finished this sentence, however, for at the moment a heavy crash shook the forest from end to end. Magnus, what are you doing over there? Why are you sniffing those shoes, little weirdo man? Chapter 6, The Lion and the Unicorn. Actually, let me see how long this is before I keep going. 6, 7, 8... Wait. 5, 6, 7... What, you skipped 7? Rude. 9, 10, 11, 12. They skipped 7. How rude of them. Wait, no, I'm blind. 6, 7, 8. My brain is full of holes. Okay, yeah, we can finish this. We can finish this. I'll keep going. Chapter 7. The Lion and the Unicorn. The next moment, soldiers came running through the wood, at first in 2s and 3s, then 10 or 20 together, and at last in such whole crowds they seemed to fill the whole forest. Alice got behind a tree for fear of being run over and watched them go by. Yeah, shocking no one. Blind in one eye, can't see out of the other. She thought that she thought that in all her life she'd never seen soldiers so uncertain on their feet. They were always tripping over something or other, and whenever one went down, several more always fell over him, so that the ground was soon covered with little heaps of men. Then came the horses. Having 4 feet, these managed rather better than the foot soldiers, but even they stumbled now and then. It seemed to be a regular rule that whenever a horse stumbled, the rider fell off instantly. The confusion got worse every moment, and Alice was very glad to get out of the wood into an open place, where she found the White King seated on the ground, busily writing in his memorandum book. I've sent them all, the king cried in a tone of delight on seeing Alice. Did you happen to meet any soldiers, my dear, as you came through the wood? Yes, I did. Several thousand, I should think. 4,207. That's the exact number, the king said, referring to his book. I couldn't send all the horses, you know, because 2 of them are wanted in the game, and I haven't sent the 2 messengers either. They're both gone to the town, but just look along the road. Tell me if you can see either of them. I see nobody on the road. I only wish I had such eyes, the king remarked in a fretful tone. To be able to see nobody at that distance, too. Why, it's as much as I can do to see real people by this light. Alice really out here spotting Odysseus. It's a long way home. He detoured into a mirror for a hot minute to escape Scylla and Charybdis. I definitely said one or both of those wrong, but it's fine. All this was lost on Alice, who was still looking intently along the road, shading her eyes with one hand. I see somebody now, but he's coming very slowly. What curious attitudes he goes into. For the messenger kept skipping up and down and wriggling like an eel as he came along, with his great hands spread out like fans on either side. Oh, not at all. He's an Anglo-Saxon messenger. Those are Anglo-Saxon attitudes. He only does them when he's happy. His name is Heiga. Heya. He pronounced it so as to rhyme with mayor. Heya. I love my love with an H, Alice couldn't help beginning, because he is happy. I hate him with an H because he is hideous. I feel him with ham sandwiches and hay. His name is Heya, and he lives on the hill, the king remarked simply, without the least idea that he was joining in the game, while Alice was still hesitating for the name of a town beginning with H. The other messenger's called Hatter. I must have 2, you know, to come and go. 1 to come and 1 to go. I beg your pardon? Well, it isn't respectable to beg. I only meant that I didn't understand. Why 1 to come and 1 to go? Oh, didn't I tell you? The king repeated impatiently. I must have 2 to fetch and carry, 1 to fetch and 1 to carry. At this moment the messenger arrived. He was far too much out of breath to say a word, and could only wave his hands about, and make the most fearful faces at the poor king. This young lady loves you with an H, the king said, introducing Alice in the hope of turning off the messenger's attention from himself. But it was no use. The Anglo-Saxon attitudes only got more extraordinary every moment, while the great eyes rolled wildly from one side to the other. Wish you all could have just seen the jump Magnus made. He just left my chair full of holes. Really should just reupholster the whole thing. Anyway. You alarm me. I feel faint. Give me a ham sandwich. On which the messenger, to Alice's great amusement, opened a bag that hung round his neck and handed a sandwich to the king, who devoured it greedily. Another sandwich.
But there's nothing but hay left now,
Said the messenger, peering into the bag.
Oh, hay then,
The king murmured in a faint whisper. Alice was glad to see it revived him a good deal.
Oh, there's nothing like eating hay when you're faint,
he remarked as he munched away. I should think throwing cold water over you would be better. Boys, I don't think you should try and share the top of the chair. You have enough trouble trying to share the window. Oh, excuse me, sir. Are you aware that there is a rule against beans on the table? Yeah, you are. Should we shame the boy for being on the table? I don't think we should. I think he got down fast enough. Anyway, I should think throwing cold water over you would be better, or some sal volatile.
I didn't say there was nothing better. I said there was nothing like it, you see.
Which Alice did not adventure to deny. Ooh. Library, you know there's no beans on the table. Look at this man. Look at this man. Flagrantly violating the rules and trying to scratch his dad's face at the same time. Okay. You did not need to panic there. I had it. Hey, Magnus, could we not? Excuse me, sir. Sir, I don't believe I've issued a digging permit there. The digging permit is over there in the litter box and nowhere else. Oh man, I'm scatterbrained today. Brain everywhere. Scattered all over the place. Anyway. Who did you pass on the road? The king went on, holding out his hand to the messenger for some more hay.
Nobody.
Quite right. This young lady saw him too, so of course nobody walks slower than you. I do my best, the messenger said in a sulky tone. I'm sure nobody walks much faster than I do.
Oh, he can't do that, or else he'd have been here first. However, now that you've got your breath, you may tell us what's happened in the town.
I'll whisper it, said the messenger, putting his hands to his mouth in the shape of a trumpet and stooping so as to get close to the king's ear. Alice was sorry for this, as she wanted to hear the news too. However, instead of whispering, he simply shouted at the top of his voice, "Again!"
You call that a whisper?
cried the poor king, jumping up and shaking himself.
If you do such a thing again, I'll have you buttered. It went through and through my head like an earthquake.
It would have to be a very tiny earthquake. Who were at it again? Thought, and then asked Alice.
Why, the lion and the unicorn, of course.
Fighting for the crown?
Yes, to be sure. The best of the joke is that it's my crown all along. Let's run and see them.
As they trotted off, Alice repeated to herself as she ran the words of the old song. The lion and the unicorn were fighting for the crown. The lion beat the unicorn all around the town. Some gave them white bread, some gave them brown, some gave them plum cake, and drummed them out of town. Does the one that wins get the crown? She asked as well she could, as the run was putting her quite out of breath.
Dear me, no. What an idea.
Would you be good enough, Alice panted out after running a little farther, to stop a minute, just to get one's breath again?
I'm good enough, but only I'm not strong enough. You see, a minute goes by so fearfully quick, might as well try to stop a bandersnatch.
Alice had no more breath for talking, so they trotted on in silence till they came in sight of a great crowd, in the middle of which the lion and the unicorn were fighting. They were in such a cloud of dust that at first Alice could not make out which was which, but she soon managed to distinguish the unicorn by his horn. They placed themselves close to where Hata, the other messenger, was standing watching the fight, with a cup of tea in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other.
Oh, he's only just out of prison, and he hadn't finished his tea when he was sent in.
Minish whispered to Alice.
They only give him oyster shells in there, so he's very hungry and thirsty. How are you, dear child?
He went on, putting his arm affectionately around Hata's neck. Hata looked round and nodded, went back on with his bread and butter.
Were you happy in prison, dear child?
Said Heya. Hata looked round once more, and this time a tear or two trickled down his cheek, but not a word he would say.
Oh, speak, can't you?
Heya cried impatiently, but Hata only munched away and drank some tea.
Speak, don't you? How are they getting on with the fight?
Hata made a desperate effort and swallowed a very large piece of bread and butter.
They're getting on very well,
He said in a choking voice.
Each of them has been down about 87 times.
I suppose they'll soon bring the white bread and the brown,
Alice ventured to remark.
It's waiting for them now. This is a bit of it as I'm eating.
Library. Sorry, library is attempting to zoom. Buddy, can you give me like an hour? Like half an hour. Anyway, there was a pause in the fight just then, and the lion and the unicorn sat down, panting, while the king called out,
10 minutes allowed for refreshments.
Heya and Hata set to work at once, carrying rough trays of white and brown bread. Alice took a piece to taste, but it was very dry.
I don't think they'll fight any more today,
The king said to Hata.
Go and order the drums to begin.
And Hata went bounding away like a grasshopper. For a minute or two, Alice stood silent, watching him, and suddenly she brightened up.
Look, look!
She pointed out eagerly.
There's the White Queen running across the country. She came across flying out of the wood over yonder. How fast those queens can run!
Oh, there's some enemy after her, no doubt, the king said, without even looking round. That wood's full of them, you see.
But are she going to run and help her?
Alice asked, very much surprised at his taking it so quietly.
No use, no use. She runs so fearfully quick. Might as well try to catch a bandersnatch. But I'll make a memorandum about her if you like. She's a dear good creature,
he repeated softly to himself as he opened his memorandum book.
Do you spell creature with a double E?
At this moment the unicorn sauntered by them with his hands in his pockets.
I had the best of it this time,
he said to the king, just glancing at him as he passed.
Oh, a little,
the king replied rather nervously.
You shouldn't have run him through with your horn, you know.
Oh, it didn't hurt him, the unicorn said carelessly, and he was going on when his eye happened to fall upon Alice. He turned round rather instantly and stood for some time looking at her with an air of the deepest disgust.
What is this? This is a child,
Heya replied eagerly, coming in front of Alice to introduce her, spreading out both his hands toward her in an Anglo-Saxon attitude.
We only found it today. It's large as life, and twice as natural.
I always thought they were fabulous monsters. Is it alive?
It can talk,
said Heya solemnly. Magnus, buddy. Oh, you stopped. Never mind. I was going to pick you up and shame you. But he stopped, so we're good. But the unicorn looked dreamily at Alice and said, Talk, child. Alice could not help her lips curling up into a smile as she began. Do you know, I always thought unicorns were fabulous monsters, too. I never saw one alive before.
Well, now that we've seen each other, if you believe in me, I'll believe in you. Is that a bargain?
Yes, if you like.
Come, fetch out the plum cake, old man, the unicorn went on, turning from her to the king. None of your brown bread for me.
Oh, certainly, certainly, and the king muttered and then beckoned to Heya.
Open the bag, quick, not that one, that's full of hay.
Heya took a large cake out of the bag and gave it to Alice to hold while he got out a dish and a carving knife. How they all came out of it Alice couldn't guess. It was just like a conjuring trick. The lion had joined them while this was going on. He looked very tired and sleepy, and his eyes were half shut.
What's this?
He said, blinking lazily at Alice, and then speaking in a deep, hollow tone that sounded like the ringing of a great bell.
Oh, what is it now? You'll never guess. I couldn't.
The lion looked at Alice wearily.
Are you animal, vegetable, or mineral?
He said, yawning at every other word.
It's a fabulous monster,
The unicorn cried out before Alice could reply.
And hand round the plum cake monster,
the lion said, lying down and putting his chin on his paws.
Oh, sit down, both of you. Play fair with the cake, you know.
The king was evidently very uncomfortable at having to sit down between two great creatures, but there was no other place for him.
What a fight we might have for the crown now,
the unicorn said, looking slyly up at the crown, which the poor king was nearly shaking off his head, he trembled so much. "Oh, I should win easy," said the lion.
I'm not so sure of that, said the unicorn.
I beat you all round the town, you chicken," the lion replied angrily, half getting up as he spoke. Here the king interrupted to prevent the quarrel going on. He was very nervous, and his voice quite quivered.
All round the town, that's a good long way.
"Did you go by the old bridge or the marketplace? You get the best view by the old bridge, you know." I'm sure I don't know. The lion growled out as he lay down again. "There was too much dust to see anything. What a time that monster is, cutting up that cake." Alice had seated herself on the bank of a little brook, with a great dish in her knees, and sawing away diligently with a knife.
It's very provoking,
she said in reply to the lion. She was getting quite used to being called the monster, you see.
I've cut several slices already, but they always join on again.
You don't know how to manage looking-glass cakes. Hand it round first and cut it afterwards.
This sounded nonsense, but Alice very obediently got up, carried the dish round, and the cake divided itself into 3 pieces as she did so. "Now cut it up," the lion said as she returned to her place with the empty dish.
I say, this isn't fair,"
cried the unicorn as Alice sat with a knife in her hand, very much puzzled how to begin.
The monster's given the lion twice as much as me.
Hey, can we not do that? I want to finish reading. I'm just going to ignore him digging. It's very quickly turning into just me stopping way too often. "She's kept none for herself, anyhow," said the lion. "Do you like plum cake, monster?" He heard me say, "I will ignore you," and then immediately started digging an even worse place. Come here. Come here. I'm shaming you on the street. Shaming you on the internet. Yep. Shame time. Time for shame. Shame for the boy. Shame the kitty cat. Look at this man. He's been digging in everything all night. Shame, shame, shame. Yeah, well, maybe don't do that. Oh, you don't need to give me the kicks. That's rude. Tell you what, folks. No, we can keep going. Sorry, I was looking at the time. Like, oh man, I'm out of time. No, I'm not out of time. Anyhow. Do you like plum cake, monster? But before Alice could answer him, the drums began. Where the noise came from, she couldn't make out. The air seemed full of it, and it rang through and through her head, till she felt quite deafened. She started to her feet, and sprang across the little brook in her terror, and had just time to see the lion and the unicorn rise to their feet with angry looks at being interrupted in their feast, before she dropped to her knees and put her hands over her ears, trying vainly to shut out the dreadful uproar. "If that doesn't run them out of town, nothing ever will," she thought to herself. Chapter 8. It's My Own Invention. After a while, the noise seemed gradually to die away, till all was dead silence, and Alice lifted up her head in some alarm. There was no one to be seen, and her first thought was that she must have been dreaming about the lion and the unicorn and those queer Anglo-Saxon messengers. However, there was still the great dish lying at her feet, on which she had tried to cut the plum cake. "So I wasn't dreaming after all," she said to herself. Unless we're all part of the same dream. Only I do hope it's my dream and not the Red King's. I don't like belonging to another person's dream," she went on in a rather complaining tone. "I've got a great mind to go and wake him, see what happens." At this moment her thoughts were interrupted by a loud shouting of "Ahoy! Ahoy! Chick!" And a knight dressed in crimson armor came galloping down upon her, brandishing a great club. Just as he reached her, the horse stopped suddenly. "You're my prisoner!" the knight cried as he tumbled off his horse. Startled as she was, Alice was more frightened for him than herself at the moment, and watched him with some anxiety as he mounted again. As soon as he was comfortably in the saddle, he began once more, "You're my—" But another voice broke in here, "Ahoy, ahoy, check!" And Alice looked round in some surprise for the new enemy. This time it was a white knight, He drew up at Alice's side and tumbled off his horse just as the Red Knight had done. Then he got on again, and the two knights sat and looked at each other. For some time without speaking, Alice looked from one to the other in some bewilderment. Magnus, no beans on the table. You know the rules. Hey, you with the toe beans. No beans on the table. Them's the rules. That's more beans on the table, not no. Yeah, go hide under the couch. Cause under the couch problems. Those I can ignore. Anyway.
She's my prisoner, you know,
The Red Knight said at last.
Yes, but then I came and rescued her,
The White Knight replied.
Well, we must fight for her then,
Said the Red Knight as he took up his helmet, which hung from the saddle and was something the shape of a horse's head, and put it on.
You will observe the rules of battle, of course,
The White Knight remarked, putting on his helmet too.
I always do,
Said the Red Knight, and they began banging away at each other with such fury that Alice got behind a tree to be out of the way of the blows. I wonder now what the rules of battle are, she said to herself as she watched the fight, timidly peeping out from her hiding place. One rule seems to be that if one knight hits the other, he knocks him off his horse, and if he misses, he tumbles off himself. And another rule seems to be that they hold their clubs with their arms, as if they were Punch and Judy. What a noise they make when they tumble, just like a whole set of fire irons falling onto the fender. Library, can you leave the chair alone? The boys are getting increasingly zoomy, so I either need to read faster and ignore them, or both. Probably both. The fire irons. How quiet the horses are. They just let them get on and off them as if they were tables. Another rule of battle that Alice had not noticed seemed to be that they always fell on their heads, and the battle ended with them both falling off in this way, side by side. When they got up again, they shook hands, then the Red Knight mounted and galloped off.
It was a glorious victory, wasn't it?
Said the White Knight as he came up panting. I don't know. I don't want to be anybody's prisoner. I want to be a queen.
Oh, so you will when you've crossed the next brook. I'll see you safe to the end of the wood, and then I must go back, you know. That's the end of my move.
Thank you very much. May I help you off with your helmet? It was evidently more than he could manage by himself. However, she managed to shake him out of it at last.
Oh, now one can breathe more easily,
said the knight, putting back his shaggy hair with both hands, and turning his gentle face and large, mild eyes to Alice. She thought she had never seen such a strange-looking soldier in all her life. He was dressed in tin armor, which seemed to fit him very badly. He had a queer-shaped little deal box fastened across his shoulder, upside down and with the lid hanging open. Alice looked at it with great curiosity. Hang on a second. I have had an idea. You know, that thing I normally do. Should be at least one more snowball here. I will distract the cats from their problems with snowballs. I want to emphasize this very aggressively. These are plush snowballs. So when I throw them at the cat, they are doing nothing. Practically. Nothing other than startling him, at least. Great curiosity.
I see you're admiring my little box, the knight said in a friendly tone. It's my own invention, to keep clothes and sandwiches in. You see, I carry it upside down so the rain can't get in.
Oh, but the things get out. Do you know the lid's open?
I didn't know it,
the knight said, a shade of vexation passing over his face.
Then all the things must have fallen out. The box is no use without them.
He unfastened it as he spoke, and was just going to throw it into the bushes when a sudden thought seemed to strike him, and he hung it carefully on a tree.
Can you guess why I did that?
Alice shook her head.
In hopes some bees may make a nest in it, then I should get the honey.
But you got a beehive, or something like one, fastened to the saddle.
Yes, it's a very good beehive,
the knight said in a discontented tone.
One of the best kind, but not a single bee has come near it yet, and the other thing is a mousetrap. Suppose the mice keep the bees out, or the bees keep the mice out. I don't know which.
I was wondering why the mousetrap was there. It isn't very likely there'd be mice on the horse's back.
Not very likely, perhaps, but if they do come, I can't choose to have them running about. You see, it's well to be provided for everything. That's why the reason the horse has all those anklets round his feet.
What are they for?
To guard against the bites of sharks. It's an invention of my own. Now help me on, I'll help you to the end of the wood. What's the dish for?
It's meant for plum cake.
We'd better take it with us. It'll be handy if we find any plum cake. Help me to get it into this bag.
This took a very long time to manage, although Alice held the bag open very carefully, because the knight was so very awkward in putting in the dish. The first 2 or 3 times he tried, he fell in himself again.
It's a rather tight fit, you see, he said as they got it in at last. There's so many candlesticks in the bag.
And he hung it to the saddle, which was already loaded with bunches of carrots and fire irons and many other things.
I hope you've got your hair well fastened on.
Only in the usual way.
That's hardly enough. You'll see the wind is so very strong here, strong as soup.
Have you invented a plan for keeping the hair from being blown off?
Not yet, but I've got a plan for keeping it from falling off.
I should like to hear it very much.
Well, first, you take an upright stick. Then you make your hair creep up on it like a fruit tree. The reason the hair falls off is because it hangs down. Things never fall upwards, you know. It's a plan of my own invention. You may try it if you like.
It didn't quite sound like a comfortable plan, Alice thought, and for a few minutes she walked on in silence, puzzling over the idea, and every now and then stopping to help the poor knight, who certainly was not a good rider. Whenever the horse stopped, which it did very often, he fell off in front. Whenever it went on again, which it generally did rather suddenly, he fell off behind. Otherwise he kept on pretty well, except he had a habit of now and then falling off sideways, and as he generally did this on the side which Alice was walking, she soon found that it was the best plan not to walk quite close to the horse. "I'm afraid you've not had much practice in riding," she ventured to say, as she was helping him up from his 5th tumble. The knight looked very much surprised and a little offended at the remark.
What makes you say that?"
he asked, as he scrambled back into the saddle, keeping hold of Alice's hair with one hand to save himself from falling over on the other side. "Because people don't fall off quite so often when they have had much practice?"
"I've had plenty of practice, plenty of practice."
Alice could think of nothing better to say than, "Indeed?" But she said it as heartily as she could. They went on a little way in silence after this, the knight with his eyes shut, muttering to himself, and Alice watching anxiously for the next tumble.
"The great art of riding," the knight began suddenly in a loud voice, waving his right arm as he spoke, "is to keep—"
And here the sentence ended as suddenly as it had begun, because the knight fell heavily on the top of his head, exactly in the path where Alice was walking. She was quite frightened this time, and said in an anxious tone as she picked him up, "I hope no bones are broken."
"None to speak of,"
the knight said, as if he didn't mind breaking 2 or 3 of them.
"The great art of riding, as I was saying, is to keep your balance properly, like this, you know."
He let go of the bridle and stretched out both his arms to show Alice what he meant, and this time he fell flat on his back, right under the horse's feet.
"Plenty of practice,"
he went on repeating, all the time that Alice was getting him on his feet again.
"Plenty of practice."
"It's too ridiculous," cried Alice, losing all her patience this time. "You ought to have a wooden horse on wheels, that you ought."
"Does that kind go smoothly?"
the knight asked in a tone of great interest, clasping his arms round the horse's neck as he spoke, just in time to save himself from tumbling off again. "Much more smoothly than a live horse," Alice said, with a little scream of laughter, in spite of all she could do to prevent it.
"I'll get one or two.
Several." There was a short silence after this, and then the knight went on again.
"I'm a great hand at inventing things. Now, I dare say you noticed the last time you picked me up I was looking rather thoughtful."
"You were a little grave."
"But just then I was inventing a new way of getting over a gate. Would you like to hear it?"
"Very much indeed."
"I'll tell you how I came to think of it. You see, I said to myself, the only difficulty is with the feet. The head is high enough already. Now, first I put my head on top of the gate, and then stand on my head. Then the feet are high enough, you see, that I'm over, you see."
"Yes, I suppose you'd be over when that was done. But don't you think it'd be rather hard?"
"Well, I haven't tried it yet, so I can't tell for certain, but I'm afraid it would be a little hard."
He looked so vexed at that idea that Alice changed the subject hastily. What a curious helmet you've got. Is that your invention, too? The knight looked down proudly at his helmet, which hung from the saddle. Yes, but I've invented a better one than that, like a sugar loaf. I used to wear it. If I fell off the horse, it always touched the ground directly, so I had a very little way to fall, you see. But there was danger of falling into it, to be sure. That happened to me once, and the worst of it was, before I could get out again, the other white knight came and put it on. He thought it was his own helmet. The knight looked so solemn about that Alice did not dare to laugh. Sugarloaf, for context. I presume they are speaking of an old-fashioned sugarloaf that's kind of like a cone-looking thing. So then he's like, oh yeah, falling into it, the sugarloaf being kind of pointed, sticking into the ground. Anyway, I'm afraid you must have hurt him, she said in a trembling voice, being on top of his head. Oh, I had to kick him, of course, the knight said very seriously. Then he took the helmet off again, but it took hours and hours to get me out. I was fast as lightning, you know. But that's a different kind of fastness, Alice objected. The knight shook his head. There is all kinds of fastness with me, I can assure you. He raised his hands in some excitement as he said this, and instantly rolled out of the saddle and fell headlong into a deep ditch. Alice ran to the other side of the ditch to look for him. She was rather startled by the fall. For some time he'd kept on very well. She was afraid he really was hurt this time. However, though she could see nothing but the soles of his feet, she was much relieved to hear that he was talking on in his usual tone. All kinds of fastness, but it was careless of him to put on another man's helmet, too, with the man in it even worse. How can you go on talking so quietly, head downwards? Alice asked as she dragged him out by his feet and laid him in the heap on the bank. The knight looked surprised at the question. What does it matter where my body happens to be? My mind goes on working all the same, in fact. The more head downwards I am, the more I keep inventing new things. Now, the cleverest thing of the sort that I ever did, it was inventing a new pudding among the meat course. In time to have it cooked for the next course? Well, not the next course, the knight said in a slow, thoughtful tone. No, certainly not the next course. Then it would have to be the next day, I suppose. You wouldn't have 2 pudding courses in one dinner. Well, not the next day, he repeated as before. Not the next day. In fact, he went on, holding his head down and his voice getting lower and lower, I don't believe that pudding was ever cooked. I don't believe that pudding ever will be cooked, and yet it was a very clever pudding to invent. What do you mean? What did you mean it to be made of? Alice asked, hoping to cheer him up, for the poor knight seemed quite low-spirited about it. It began with blotting paper, the knight answered with a groan. Oh, that wouldn't be very nice, I'm afraid. Not very nice alone, he interrupted quite eagerly. But you've no idea what a difference it makes, mixing it with other things. Gunpowder, sealing wax. Here I must leave you. They had just come to the end of the wood. Alice could only look puzzled. She was thinking of the pudding. You are sad. Let me sing you a song to comfort you, the knight said in an anxious tone. Oh, is it very long? For Alice had heard a good deal of poetry that day. It's long, but very, very beautiful. Everybody hears me sing it. It brings tears into their eyes, or else what? When the knight had made a sudden pause. Or else it doesn't, you know. The name of the song is called Haddock's Eyes. Oh, that's the name of the song, is it? Alice said, trying to feel interested. No, you don't understand, the knight said, looking a little vexed. That's what the name is called. The name is really the aged man. Then I ought to have said that's what the song is called? Alice corrected itself. No, you oughtn't. That's quite another thing. The song is called Ways and Means, but that's only what it's called, you know. Well, what is the song, then? Said Alice, who was by this time completely bewildered. I was coming to that. The song really is a sitting on a gate, and the tune's my own invention. So saying, he stopped his horse and let the reins fall on its neck, then slowly beating time with one hand, and a faint smile lighting up on his gentle, foolish face, as if he enjoyed the music of his song, he began. Of all the strange things that Alice saw in her journey through the looking-glass, this was the one that she always remembered most clearly. Years afterward she could bring the whole scene back again as if it were only yesterday. The mild blue eyes and kindly smile of the knight, the setting sun gleaming through his hair and shining on his armor in a blaze of light that quite dazzled her, the horse quietly moving about, with the reins hanging loose on his neck, cropping the grass at her feet, and the black shadows of the forest behind. All this she took in like a picture. With one hand shading her eyes, she leaned against a tree, watching the strange pair and listening. In a half-dream, the melancholy music of a song. "Oh, but the tune isn't his own invention," she said to herself. "It's 'I give thee all, I can no more.'" She stood and listened very attentively, but no tears came into her eyes. I don't think I know the tune to that. Not off the top of my head, so you don't have to hear me try and squeeze these words into that tune. Fun. "I'll tell thee everything I can, there's little to relate. I saw an aged man a-sitting on a gate. 'Who are you, aged man?' I said, 'and how is it you live?' And his answer trickled through my head like water through a sieve. He said, 'I look for butterflies that sleep among the wheat. I make them into mutton pies and sell them in the street. I sell them unto men,' he said, 'who sail on stormy seas, and that's the way I get my bread, a trifle, if you please.' But I was thinking of a plan to dye one's whiskers green, and always use so large a pan that they could not be seen. So having no reply to give to what the old man said, I cried, 'Come tell me how you live,' and thumped him on the head. His accents mild took up the tale. He said, 'I go my ways, and when I find a mountain rill, I set it in a blaze, and thence they make a stuff they call Roland's Mascar oil, rather. Yet 2 pence halfpenny is all they give me for my toil. But I was thinking of a way to feed oneself on batter, and go on from day to day, getting a little fatter.' I shook him well from side to side until his face was blue. 'Come tell me how you live,' I cried, 'and what it is you do.' He said, 'I hunt for haddocks' eyes among the weather bright, and work them into waistcoat buttons in the silent night. And these I do not sell for gold or coin of silvery shine, but for a copper halfpenny, and that will purchase 9. Sometimes I dig for buttered rolls, or set lime twigs for crabs. I sometimes search the grassy knolls for wheels of hansom cabs. And that's the way,' he gave a wink, 'by which I get my wealth, and very gladly will I drink your honour's noble health.' I heard him then, for I had just completed my design to keep the men I bridge from rust by boiling it in wine. I thanked him much for telling me the way he got his wealth, but chiefly for his wish that he might drink my noble health. And now, if e'er a chance I put my fingers into glue, or madly squeeze a right-hand foot into a left-hand shoe, or if I drop upon my toe a very heavy weight, I weep, for it reminds me so of that old man I used to know, whose look was mild, whose speech was slow, whose hair was whiter than the snow, whose face was very like a crow, with eyes like cinders all aglow, who seemed distracted with his woe, who rocked his body to and fro, and muttered mumblingly and low, as if his mouth were full of dough, who snorted like a buffalo that summer evening long ago, a-sitting on a gate." As the knight sang the last words of the ballad, he gathered up the reins and turned his horse's head along the road by which they'd come. "You've only a few yards to go, down the hill, over that little brook, then you'll be a queen." Ow! Library. You gotta work on your aim if you're gonna try and zoom over me, cat. Oh. He didn't nail my arm as hard as I thought he did, but he certainly felt like it. "You'll be a queen. But you'll stay and see me off first," he added, as Alice turned with an eager look in the direction to which he pointed. "I shan't be long. You'll wait and wave your handkerchief when I get to that turn in the road. I think it'll encourage me, you see." "Oh, of course I'll wait. And thank you very much for coming so far, and for the song. I liked it very much."
"I hope so, but you didn't cry so much as I thought you would."
"Well, yes, you were being interrupted by a very rowdy cat, you see." That was not in the book. That was me throwing shade at my little guy here. Oh, one man. Can you just lie down, please? Perhaps?
Just lie down. Just lie down. Maybe? No? Okay. So they shook hands, and then the knight rode slowly away into the forest.
It won't take long to see him off, I expect, Alice said to herself as she stood watching him. There he goes, right on his head as usual. However, he gets on again pretty easily. Oh, that must come of having so many things hung round the horse. So she went on talking to herself as she watched the horse walking leisurely along the road, and the knight tumbling off first on one side, then on the other. After the fourth or fifth tumble, he reached the turn, and she waved her handkerchief to him and waited till he was out of sight. I hope it encouraged him, she said as she turned to run down the hill. Now for the last brook, to be a queen. How grand it sounds. A very few steps brought her to the edge of the brook. The 8th square at last, she cried as she bounded across, and threw herself down to rest on a lawn as soft as moss, with little flower beds dotted about it here and there. Oh, how glad I am to get here. What is this on my head? She exclaimed in a tone of dismay as she put her hands up to something very heavy and fitted tight all round her head. But how can it have got there without my knowing it? She said to herself as she lifted it off and set it on her lap to make out what it could possibly be. It was a golden crown. Chapter 9. Queen Alice. Well, this is grand. I never expected I should be a queen so soon. And I'll tell you what it is, your majesty, she went on in a severe tone. She was always rather fond of scolding herself. It'll never do for you to be lolling about on the grass like that. Queens have to be dignified, you know. So she got up and walked about, rather stiffly just at first, as she was afraid her crown might come off. But she comforted herself with the thought that there was nobody to see her. And if I really am a queen, she said as she sat down again, I shall be able to manage it quite well in time. Everything was happening so oddly that she didn't feel a bit surprised at finding the Red Queen and the White Queen sitting close to her, one on each side. She would have liked very much to ask them how they came here, but she feared it wouldn't be quite civil. However, there would be no harm, she thought, in asking if the game was over. Please, would you tell me? She began, looking timidly at the Red Queen. Speak when you're spoken to, the Queen sharply interrupted her. Oh, but if everybody obeyed that rule, said Alice, who was always ready for a little argument, and if you only spoke when you were spoken to, and the other person always waited for you to begin, you would see that nobody ever said anything, so that... Oh, ridiculous! Why don't you see, child? Here she broke off with a frown, and, after thinking for a minute, suddenly changed the subject of the conversation. What do you mean by if you really are a queen? What right have you to call yourself so? You can't be a queen, you know, until you've passed the proper examination. And the sooner we begin it, well, the better. I only said if. The two queens looked at each other, and the Red Queen remarked with a little shudder, She says that she only said if. But she said a great deal more than that. The White Queen groaned, wringing her hands. Oh, so much more than that. So you did, you know, the Red Queen said to Alice. Always speak the truth. Think before you speak, and write it down afterwards. I'm sure I didn't mean... Alice was beginning, but the Red Queen interrupted her impatiently. That's just what I complain of. You should have meant. Why do you suppose is the use of child without any meaning? Even a joke should have some meaning, and a child's more important than a joke, I hope. You couldn't deny that, even if you tried with both hands. I don't deny things with my hands. Nobody said you did, said the Red Queen. I said you couldn't if you tried. She's in that state of mind, said the White Queen, that she wants to deny something, only she doesn't know what to deny. A nasty, vicious temper, said the Red Queen, and there was an uncomfortable silence for a minute or two. The Red Queen broke the silence by saying to the White Queen, I invite you to Alice's dinner party this afternoon. The White Queen smiled feebly and said, And I invite you. I didn't know I was to have a party at all, said Alice. But if there is to be one, I think I ought to invite the guest. Well, we gave you the opportunity of doing it, the Red Queen remarked. But I dare say you've not had many lessons in manners yet. Manners are not taught in lessons. Lessons teach you to do sums and things of that sort. And you do addition? The White Queen asked. What's one and 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 one? I don't know. I lost count. I think it's 10. How many ones are there? I also lost count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
9, 10. It is 10. I can count. Can you believe it? I made it, Ma. I can count.
She can't do addition, the Red Queen interrupted. Can you do subtraction? Take 9 from 8. 9 from 8? I can't, but... Alice replied very readily, cutting herself off. Oh, she can't do subtraction, said the White Queen. Can you do division? Divide a loaf by a knife? What's the answer to that? Also, here's where we go, oh no, it's math. I suppose, Alice was beginning, but the Red Queen answered for her. Oh, bread and butter, of course. Try another subtraction sum. Take a bone from a dog. What remains? Alice considered for a long moment. Oh, the bone wouldn't remain, of course, if I took it, and the dog wouldn't remain. It'd come to bite me, and I'm sure I shouldn't remain. Then you think nothing would remain? I think that's the answer. Wrong as usual. The dog's temper would remain, said the Red Queen. I don't see how. Why, look here. The dog would lose its temper, wouldn't it? The Red Queen cried. Perhaps it would. And if the dog went away, its temper would remain, the Queen exclaimed triumphantly. Alice said, as gravely as she could, Oh, they might go different ways. But she couldn't help thinking to herself, what dreadful nonsense we're talking. Oh, she can't do sums a bit, the Queen said together with great emphasis. Can you do sums? Alice said, turning suddenly on the White Queen, for she didn't like being found fault with so much. The Queen gasped and shut her eyes. I can do addition if you give me time, but I can't do subtraction under any circumstances. Of course you know your ABC, said the Red Queen. To be sure I do. So do I, the White Queen whispered. We'll often say it over together, dear, and I'll tell you a secret. I can read words of one letter. Isn't that grand? Don't be discouraged. You'll come to it in time. Here the Red Queen began again. Can you answer useful questions? How's bread made? Oh, I know that. You take some flour. Where do you pick the flour? The White Queen asked. In a garden or in the hedges? Well, it isn't picked at all. It's ground. How many acres of ground? Said the White Queen. You mustn't leave out so many things. Fan her head, the Red Queen anxiously interrupted. She'll be feverish after so much thinking. So they set to work and fanned her with bunches of leaves, so she had to beg them to leave off. It blew her hair about so. She's all right again now. Do you know languages? What's the French for fiddle-dee-dee? Said the Red Queen. Fiddle-dee-dee's not English, Alice replied gravely. Whoever said it was? Alice thought she saw a way out of the difficulty this time. If you tell me what language fiddle-dee-dee is, I'll tell you the French for it. But the Red Queen drew herself up rather stiffly and said, Queens never make bargains. I wish queens never asked questions, Alice thought to herself. Don't let us quarrel, the White Queen said in an anxious tone. What's the cause of lightning? The cause of lightning, Alice said very decidedly, for she felt quite certain about this, is the thunder. No. She hastily corrected herself. I meant the other way. It's too late to correct it, said the Red Queen. When you've once said a thing, that fixes it, and you must take the consequences. Which reminds me, the White Queen said, looking down and nervously clasping and unclasping her hands. We've had such a thunderstorm last Tuesday. I mean, one of the last set of Tuesdays, you know. Alice was puzzled. In our country, there's only one day at a time. The Red Queen said, It's a poor thin way of doing things. Now here we mostly have days and nights of 2, 3 at a time. Sometimes in the winter we take as many as 5 nights together for warmth, you know. Are 5 nights warmer than 1 night, then? If 5 times as warm, they should be 5 times as cold by the same rule. Just so, 5 times as warm, 5 times as cold, just as I'm 5 times as rich as you are, and 5 times as clever, cried the Red Queen. Alice sighed and gave it up. It's exactly like a riddle with no answer, she thought. Humpty Dumpty saw it too, the White Queen went on in a low voice, more as if she were talking to herself. He came to the door with a corkscrew in his hand. And what did he want? Said the Red Queen. He said he would come in, the White Queen went on. He was looking for a hippopotamus. Now, as it happened, there wasn't such a thing in the house that morning. Is there generally? Alice asked in an astonished tone. Well, only on Thursdays, said the Queen. I know what he came for. He wanted to punish the fish because... Here the White Queen began again. It was such a thunderstorm you can't think. Oh, she never could, you know, said the Red Queen.
Oh, part of the roof came off, and ever so much thunder got in, and was rolling around the room in great lumps and knocking over tables and things, till I was so frightened I couldn't remember my own name."
Alice thought to herself, I never should try to remember my name in the middle of an accident. Where would be the use of it? But she didn't say this aloud, for fear of hurting the Queen's feelings. "Your Majesty must excuse her," the Red Queen said to Alice, taking one of the White Queen's hands in her own and gently stroking it. "Oh, she means well, but she can't help saying foolish things as a general rule." The White Queen timidly looked at Alice, who felt she ought to say something kind, but she really couldn't think of anything at the moment. "She never was really well brought up," the Red Queen went on. "It's amazing how good-tempered she is. Pat her on the head, see how pleased she'll be." But this was more than Alice had courage to do. "A little kindness and putting her hair in papers would do wonders with her." The White Queen gave a deep sigh and laid her head on Alice's shoulder. "I'm so sleepy," she groaned. "Oh, she's tired, poor thing," said the Red Queen. "Smooth her hair, lend her your nightcap, sing her a soothing lullaby." "Well, I haven't got a nightcap with me," said Alice as she tried to obey the first direction. "I don't know any soothing lullabies." "Oh, I must do it myself, then," said the Red Queen. She began, "Hush-a-by, lady, in Alice's lap, till the feast's ready, we've time for a nap. When the feast's over, we'll go to the ball, Red Queen and White Queen, and Alice and all." "Oh, and now you know the words," she added, as she put her head down on Alice's other shoulder. "Just sing it through to me. I'm getting sleepy, too." In another moment, both queens were fast asleep and snoring loud. "What am I to do?" exclaimed Alice, looking around in great perplexity, as first one round head, then the other rolled down from her shoulder and lay like a heavy lump in her lap. "I don't think it ever happened before that anyone had to take care of two queens asleep at once. No, not in the history of England. It couldn't, you know. There was never more than one queen at a time. Do wake up, you heavy things," she went on in an impatient tone, but there was no answer but a gentle snoring. The snoring got more distinct every minute and sounded more like a tune. At last she could even make out the words, and she listened so eagerly that when the two great heads vanished from her lap, she hardly missed them. She was standing before an arched doorway over which were the words Queen Alice in large letters, and on each side of the arch there was a bell handle. One was marked Visitor's Bell, and the other Servant's Bell. "I'll wait till the song's over," thought Alice. "Then I'll ring the— Well, which bell must I ring?" she went on, very much puzzled by the name. "I'm not a visitor, and I'm not a servant. There ought to be one marked Queen, you know." And just then the door opened a little way, and a creature with a long beak put its head out for a moment and said, "No admittance through the week after next," and shut the door again with a bang. Alice knocked and rang in vain for a long time, but at last a very old frog, who was sitting under a tree, got up and hobbled slowly towards her. He was dressed in bright yellow and had enormous boots on. "What is it now?" the frog said in a deep, hoarse whisper. Alice turned round, ready to find fault with anybody. "Where's the servant whose business it is to answer the door?" "Which door?" said the frog. Alice almost stamped with irritation at the slow drawl in which he spoke. "This door, of course." The frog looked at the door with his large, dull eyes for a minute. Then he went nearer and rubbed it with his thumb as if he were trying whether the paint would come off. Then he looked at Alice. "To answer the door, what's it been asking of?" He was so hoarse that Alice could scarcely hear him. "I don't know what you mean." "I talk English." Excuse me. "I talk English, don't I? Or are you deaf? What did it ask for you?" "Nothing. I've been knocking at it." Shouldn't do that. It vexes it, you know." Then he went up and gave the door a kick with one of his great feet. "You let it alone," he panted out as he bobbled back to his tree, "and it'll let you alone, you know." At this moment the door was flung open, and a shrill voice was heard singing. To the looking-glass world it was Alice that said, "I've a sceptre in hand, I've a crown on my head. Let the looking-glass creatures, whatever they be, come and dine with the Red Queen, the White Queen, and me." And hundreds of voices joined in the chorus. "Then fill up the glasses as quick as you can, and sprinkle the table with buttons and bran. Put cats in the coffee and mice in the tea, and welcome Queen Alice with 30 times 3. There followed a confused noise of cheering, and Alice thought to herself, 30 times 3 makes 90. Wonder if anyone's counting. In a minute there was silence again, and the same shrill voice sang another verse. "Oh, looking-glass creatures," quoth Alice, "draw near. 'Tis an honour to see me, a favour to hear. 'Tis a privilege high to have dinner and tea, along with the Red Queen, the White Queen, and me." Then came the chorus again. "Then fill up the glasses with treacle and ink, or anything else that's pleasant to drink. Mix sand with the cider and wool with the wine, and welcome Queen Alice with 90 times 9. 90 times 9, Alice repeated in despair. "Oh, that'll never be done. I'd better go in at once." There was a dead silence the moment she appeared. Alice glanced nervously along the table as she walked up the large hall and noticed that there were about 50 guests of all kinds. Some were animals, some birds. There were even a few flowers among them. I'm glad they've come without waiting to be asked. I should never have known who were the right people to invite. There were 3 chairs at the head of the table. The Red and White Queens had already taken 2 of them, but the middle one was empty. Alice sat down in it, rather uncomfortable in the silence, and longing for someone to speak. At last the Red Queen began. "Oh, you've missed the soup and fish. Put it on the joint." And the waiter set a leg of mutton before Alice. She looked at it rather anxiously, as she'd never had to carve a joint before. "You look a little shy. Let me introduce you to that leg of mutton," said the Red Queen. "Alice, mutton, Alice." The leg of mutton got up in the dish and made a little bow to Alice, and Alice returned the bow, not knowing whether to be frightened or amused. "May I give you a slice?" she said, taking up the knife and fork and looking from one queen to the other. "Oh, certainly not," the Red Queen said very decidedly. It isn't etiquette to cut anyone you've been introduced to. Remove the joint." And the waiters carried it off and brought a large plum pudding in its place. "I won't be introduced to the pudding, please," Alice said rather hastily, "or we shall get no dinner at all. May I give you some?" The Queen looked rather sulky and growled, "Pudding, Alice, pudding. Remove the pudding." And the waiters took it away so quickly that Alice couldn't return its bow. However, she didn't see why the Red Queen should be the only one to give orders, so, as an experiment, she called out, "Waiter, bring back the pudding." And there it was again in a moment, like a conjuring trick. It was so large she couldn't help feeling a little shy with it, as she'd been with the mutton. However, she conquered her shyness by a great effort, and cut a slice and handed it to the Red Queen. "What impertinence!" said the pudding. "I wonder how you'd like it if I were to cut a slice out of you, you creature." It spoke in a thick, suety sort of voice, and Alice hadn't a word to say in reply. She could only sit and look at it and gasp. "Make a remark," the Red Queen said. "It's ridiculous to have all the conversation in the pudding." "Do you know, I've had such a quantity of poetry repeated to me today," Alice began, a little frightened, finding that the moment she opened her lips there was dead silence, and all eyes were fixed upon her. "It's a very curious thing, I think. Every poem was about fishes in some way. Do you know why they're so fond of fishes all about here?" She spoke to the Red Queen, whose answer was a little wide of the mark. "As to fishes," she said, very slowly and solemnly, putting her mouth close to Alice's ear, "Her White Majesty knows a lovely riddle, all in poetry, all about fishes. Shall she repeat it?" "Her Red Majesty is very kind to mention it," the White Queen murmured into Alice's other ear, in a voice like the cooing of a pigeon. "Be such a treat, may I?" "Oh, please do," Alice said very politely. The White Queen laughed with delight and stroked Alice's cheek. Then she began, "First the fish must be caught." Let me begin again. "First the fish must be caught. That is easy. A baby, I think, could have caught it. Next the fish must be bought. That is easy. A penny, I think, could have bought it. Now cook me the fish. That is easy and will not take more than a minute. Let it lie in a dish. That is easy because it already is in it. Bring it here. Let me sup. It is easy to let such a dish on the table. Take the dish cover up. Ah, that's so hard, I fear I'm unable. For it holds it like glue, holds the lid to the dish while it lies in the middle, which is easiest to do. Undish cover the fish, or discover the riddle. Discover the riddle. Take a minute to think about it, then guess," said the Red Queen. "Meanwhile, we'll drink your health. Queen Alice's health!" she screamed at the top of her voice, and all the guests began drinking it directly, and very clearly they managed it. Some of them put their glasses upon heads like extinguishers and drank all that trickled down their faces. Others upset the decanters and drank the wine as it ran off the edge of the table. 3 of them, who looked like kangaroos even, scrambled into the dish of roast mutton and began eagerly lapping up the gravy just like pigs in a trough, thought Alice. You ought to return thanks in a neat speech, the Red Queen said, frowning at Alice as she spoke. We must support you now, the White Queen whispered as Alice got up to do it very obediently, but a little frightened. Thank you very much, she whispered in reply, but I can do quite well without. That wouldn't at all be the thing, the Red Queen said very decidedly, so Alice tried to submit to it with a good grace. And they did push it, she said afterwards when she was telling her sister the history of the feast. You would have thought they wanted to squeeze me flat. In fact, it was rather difficult for her to keep in her place while she made her speech. The 2 queens pushed her so, one on each side, they nearly lifted her up into the air. I rise to return thanks, Alice began, and she really did rise as she spoke several inches, but she got hold of the edge of the table and managed to pull herself down again. Take care of yourself, screamed the White Queen, seizing Alice's hair with both her hands. Something's going to happen. And then, as Alice afterwards described it, all sorts of things happened in a moment. The candles all grew up to the ceiling, looking something like a bed of rushes with fireworks at the top. As to the bottles, they each took a pair of plates, which they hastily fitted on as wings, and so with forks for legs went fluttering about in all directions. And very like birds they looked, Alice thought to herself, as well as she could in the dreadful conclusion that was beginning. At this moment she heard a hoarse laugh at her side, and turned to see what was the matter with the White Queen, but instead of the Queen there was a leg of mutton sitting in the chair. Here I am, cried a voice from the soup tureen, and Alice turned again just in time to see the Queen's broad, good-natured face grinning at her for a moment over the edge of the tureen before she disappeared into the soup. There was not a moment to be lost. Already several of the guests were lying down in the dishes. The soup ladle was walking up the table toward Alice's chair and beckoning to her impatiently to get out of its way. I can't stand this any longer, she cried as she jumped up, seizing the tablecloth with both hands. One good pull, and plates, dishes, guests, and candles came crashing down together in a heap on the floor. And as for you, she said, turning fiercely upon the Red Queen, whom she considered as the cause of all the mischief. But the Queen was no longer at her side. She suddenly dwindled down to the size of a little doll, and was now on the table, merrily running around and around after her own shawl, which was trailing behind her. At any other time, Alice would have felt surprised at all this, but she was far too much excited to be surprised at anything now. As for you, she repeated, catching hold of the little creature in the very act of jumping over a bottle, which had just lighted on the table. I'll shake you into a kitten, that I will. Chapter 10. Shaking. Yeah, we've got a few more chapters here. Shouldn't be long, though. She took off her... Chapter 10. Shaking. She took her off the table as she spoke, and shook her backwards and forwards with all her might. The Red Queen made no resistance whatsoever, only her face grew very small, and her eyes got large and green, and still, as Alice went on shaking her, she kept on growing shorter and fatter and softer and rounder, and... Chapter 11. Waking. And it really was a kitten after all. Chapter 12. Which dreamed it. Your Majesty shouldn't purr so loud, Alice said, rubbing her eyes and addressing the kitten respectfully, yet with some severity. You woke me out of... Oh, such a nice dream. And you've been along with me, kitty, all through the looking-glass world. Did you know it, dear? It's a very inconvenient habit of kittens, Alice had once made the remark, that whatever you say to them, they always purr. If they would only purr for yes and mew for no, or any rule of the sort, she'd said, so that one could keep up a conversation. But how can you talk with a person if they always say the same thing? On this occasion, the kitten only purred, and it was impossible to guess whether it meant yes or no. So Alice hunted among the chessmen on the table till she found the Red Queen. Then she went down on her knees on the hearth-rug and put the kitten and the Queen to look at each other. Now, kitty, she cried, clapping her hands triumphantly, confess that this was what you turned into. Oh, but it wouldn't look at it, she said, when she was explaining the thing afterwards to her sister. It turned away its head, pretended not to see it, but it looked a little ashamed of itself, so I think it must have been the Red Queen. Sit up a little more stiffly, dear, Alice cried with a merry laugh, and curtsy while you're thinking what to purr. It saves time, remember. And she caught it up and gave it one little kiss, just in honor of having been a Red Queen. Snowdrop, my pet, she went on, looking over her shoulder at the white kitten, which was still sitting patiently undergoing its toilet. When will Dinah have finished with your white majesty, I wonder? That must be the reason you were so untidy in my dream. Dinah, do you know you're scrubbing a white queen? Really, it's most disrespectful of you. And what did Dinah turn to, I wonder? She prattled on as she settled comfortably down with one elbow in the rug and her chin in her hand to watch the kittens. Tell me, Dinah, did you turn to Humpty Dumpty? I think you did, however, you'd better not mention it to your friends just yet. I'm not sure. And by the way, Kitty, if you'd only been really with me in my dream, there's one thing you really would have enjoyed. I've had such a quantity of poetry said to me, all about fishes. Tomorrow morning you should have a real treat. All the time you're eating your breakfast, I'll repeat the walrus and the carpenter to you. Then you can make it believe it's oysters, dear. Now, Kitty, let's consider who it was that dreamed it all. This is a serious question, my dear. You should not go on licking your paw like that as if Dinah hadn't washed you this morning. You see, Kitty, it must have been either me or the Red King. He was part of my dream, of course, but then I was part of his dream, too. Was it the Red King, Kitty? You were his wife, my dear. You ought to know. Oh, Kitty, do help to settle it. I'm sure your paw can wait. But the provoking kitten only began on the other paw and pretended it hadn't heard the question. Which do you think it was? A boat beneath the sunny sky, lingering onward dreamily, in an evening of July. Children three that nestle near, eager eye and willing ear, pleased a simple tale to hear. Long has paled that sunny sky, echoes fade and memories die, autumn frosts have slain July. Still she haunts me, phantom-wise, Alice moving under skies never seen by waking eyes. Children yet the tale to hear, eager eye and willing ear, lovingly shall nestle near. In a wonderland they lie, dreaming as the days go by, dreaming as the summers die. Ever drifting down the stream, lingering in the golden gleam. Life, what is it but a dream? And there our tale ends of Alice Through the Looking Glass. Honestly, this one, every time I read it, much like Alice in Wonderland, it becomes very slightly longer than I ever remember it to be. I'm like, oh yeah, I can get through that in one episode, and we're just barely coming in time, and I was really speeding through the end there. I really love how the further you get into these Lewis Carroll stories, the farther they wander away from sensicality, and you can kind of sort of trace what's going on, especially if you've read it before. But it's so interesting that, like, especially with this one, as soon as we get to the dinner party, it just kind of blurs into nonsensicality, and then he just kind of tacks on that scene of, oh, she was talking to her cats the whole time, it was all a dream, as if we couldn't have just had her just left her off at the dinner party and left it unclear. It's very interesting, but that was really, really fun. I forget how much poetry lies in this one. There's a lot of little poetic phrases, and they're all in different meters too, which is kind of interesting to me. It makes me wonder if the choice of meter was meaningful at the time or something. I'm sure that's something we could dig up if we really felt like it. Anyway, this has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't